The road wound through the dense trees, snaking deeper into the heart of the Lolo National Forest. The thick canopy above allowed only sparse sunlight to filter through, casting shadows across the narrow dirt road. I gripped the steering wheel of my RV, trying to shake off the gnawing sense of unease creeping up my spine. It had been 3 hours since I'd passed another vehicle. Solitude was the whole point, wasn't it? This trip was supposed to help me clear my head, to reconnect with myself after the divorce. I had spent the last few months in a fog, and this trip to Deadwood Creek was meant to be my escape, a test of independence. No ex-husband, no stress, just me in the wilderness. I needed this. At least that's what I'd been telling myself for the past 2 weeks. Deadwood Creek Campground wasn't listed on any mainstream maps, just a blip on an obscure site for hardcore campers who sought isolation. The campground had a reputation, but that was part of the appeal. I needed remote quiet, far away from anything that reminded me of what I'd left behind. But as I pulled into the clearing, past the sign half buried in moss that read Deadwood Creek, a shiver ran through me. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you second-guess your decision to be alone. I parked the RV near a small, trickling creek. The only other vehicle was an old, beat-up camper a short distance away, nestled under the towering pines. It was empty. No sign of movement, no campfire. Good. I wasn't in the mood for socializing. I stepped out into the cool afternoon air and surveyed the site. The woods were thick, ancient. The ground was littered with pine needles, muffling the sound of my footsteps. A perfect retreat. I set up camp, unfolding my chair and setting my mug of tea beside me as I sat by the creek, listening to the soft gurgle of the water. It was peaceful, just as I'd hoped. But after a while, the peace felt off, too still. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, and the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive. My mind wandered back to the stories I'd read online, the rumors about Deadwood Creek's dark history. This used to be a mining settlement during the gold rush, or so the tale went. Dozens of men had come to find their fortunes, but most found only death. Mysterious disappearances, bodies never recovered. Some say the men still haunt the place, bound to the land, working their endless shifts beneath the earth. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to local folklore meant to spook tourists. But now, sitting alone in the fading light, the stories didn't seem so far-fetched. The wind rustled the trees, and I jumped at the sound. "Get it together, Hannah," I thought, rolling my eyes at my own nerves. I hadn't come all this way just to scare myself into leaving. That's when I saw him, a man standing near the edge of the campground, just at the tree line, leaning against a tree. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard, his clothes worn and dirty as if he'd been out here for weeks. His gaze was fixed on me. I waved awkwardly, and he lifted a hand in response before slowly walking over. "Didn't mean to spook you," he said, his voice easy, almost too casual. "Didn't expect anyone else out here this late in the season." "I wasn't expecting anyone either," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just needed some time alone, you know." "Yeah, I get that," he chuckled, though the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Rick, by the way. Been coming here for years." I nodded, unsure what to say. Rick had the look of someone who belonged out here, who knew the woods like the back of his hand. "I didn't. Be careful out here," Rick said after a pause, his gaze drifting toward the woods. "Deadwood Creek's got a history. Strange things happen when the sun goes down." My skin prickled at his words, but I forced myself to laugh. "Let me guess, ghost stories? Miners and all that?" Rick's expression didn't change. "Something like that. Just don't stray too far from your camp." He turned and walked back to his camper without another word, leaving me with a knot of unease in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. The RV was quiet, the temperature inside dropping faster than I expected. I wrapped myself in blankets and tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Then the sound started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but soon I realized it was more than that. Faint at first, barely perceptible. A rhythmic clinking echoed from the direction of the creek. It sounded like tools, mining tools, pickaxes striking rock. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding. No, I was just imagining it. This was what I came here for. Solitude. But I couldn't shake the sound. It was getting louder, the metallic rhythm persistent, almost like a heartbeat. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed out of the RV, my breath visible in the cold night air. The forest was a wall of darkness, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The sound of the creek was louder now, rushing over rocks, and I could swear I heard voices. Whispers carried on the wind. My flashlight beam swept across the campsite, catching nothing but trees and the faint shimmer of water. But then I saw them. Figures. Shadowy, half-formed shapes moving by the creek. Their outlines faint but unmistakably human. They moved like they were working, digging, swinging pickaxes in time with the clinking sound. My throat tightened as I realized they weren't there in the normal sense. They were translucent, faded. I stumbled back, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. Ghosts? No, that was impossible. I backed toward the RV, my pulse racing, but as I turned, I nearly collided with Rick. "Easy," he said, raising his hands. "I saw your light. Thought I'd come check on you." I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd just seen, but Rick didn't need me to. He just looked over at the creek and nodded, his face unreadable. "They come out at night. The miners? Been here for over a century, trapped in their own hell." I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising panic. "You mean you know about this? What is this place?" Rick gave a half smile, though it was more sad than comforting. "Deadwood Creek. These men came here to find gold, but all they found was death. Now they're stuck here, working the land forever. Some nights, they're just echoes. Other nights..." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. On other nights, they weren't just echoes. I never wanted to drive Loveland Pass again. I hadn't been back on that stretch of road since the night Marty died, the night his rig went over the edge and disappeared into the fog, like it had never existed. The only thing they found was twisted metal at the bottom of the canyon. I told myself it wasn't my fault, but the guilt stuck to me like oil on a rag, refusing to wash off no matter how many miles I put between me and that place. But Pete called in a favor. He needed me, and I owed him more than I could count. A convoy job through the Rockies, 3 trucks hauling high-value cargo to a research facility in Colorado. It was big money, but more than that, it was for Pete. He convinced me with a laugh over the phone. "Come on, Red, we need your experience out here. What could go wrong?" I didn't laugh, not this time. So there I was, back in the driver's seat of my rig, with Pete leading the convoy and another trucker, Jerry, bringing up the rear. The snow-capped peaks of the Rockies loomed ahead as we started our ascent through Loveland Pass. The winding road snaked around the mountains, a narrow, dangerous route where one wrong move could send you tumbling into nothingness. The memories hit hard as soon as we passed the first switchback, the same stretch where Marty had lost control. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the familiar weight of regret in my chest. I'd spent years avoiding convoys, always driving solo. The ghosts from that night hadn't let me forget, and now I was back, like I was inviting them to haunt me all over again. "Red, you still with us?" Pete's voice crackled over the CB, cutting through my thoughts. I pressed the mic. "Yeah, still here. Roads are getting slick. We should take it slow." Pete agreed, and we settled into the grind, navigating the treacherous turns with caution. The sun had set hours ago, and now only the thin beams of our headlights cut through the growing darkness. The fog rolled in thick and fast, curling around the edges of the road like ghostly fingers. That's when I saw it up ahead. Just barely visible through the fog was a pair of headlights. They flickered like a dying flame, appearing and disappearing in the swirling mist. I squinted, leaning forward, trying to get a better look. It was a truck, no doubt about it, but there was something familiar about the way it moved, the way it hugged the curves of the road like it had been driving this route for years. I keyed the mic again. "Pete, you see that truck up ahead?" Silence. Then Pete's voice came through, confused. "There's no truck, Red, just us." I glanced in the mirror. Jerry's headlights were still behind me, steady and unchanging. But the truck in front? It wasn't one of ours. I let go of the mic, my gut tightening. Maybe it was a local driver, someone familiar with the area. But as I watched it more closely, I knew that wasn't right. The truck was old, real old, the kind of rig you didn't see much on the road anymore. And then it hit me, hard and fast. The paint job, the faded red stripe down the side, the same color as the one Marty had on his rig. My chest tightened. "No," I whispered, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. It couldn't be Marty's truck. It was gone, destroyed, crumpled at the bottom of a canyon. But this was his rig. It had to be. The headlights flickered again, and then the truck was gone, swallowed by the fog like it had never been there. "Red, you good back there?" Pete's voice crackled through again. I didn't respond right away. My pulse was racing, my hands slick with sweat. I glanced around, looking for any sign of the truck, but the road was empty. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice shaky, "just seeing things." But I wasn't seeing things. Not this time. We kept moving, the road winding higher, the fog thickening. The curves grew sharper, and the guardrails seemed to disappear into the mist, making it feel like we were driving on the edge of the world. That's when the CB crackled again. But this time, it wasn't Pete or Jerry's voice. "Red, you gotta help me." The voice was faint, distorted, but I recognized it immediately. My heart stopped. "Marty?" I whispered, disbelief creeping into my voice. The radio stayed silent for a moment, but then it came again, clearer this time, like the words were being dragged through the static. "Red, help me. I can't hold on." I dropped the mic. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Marty was dead, gone. But that voice, it was his, down to the rasp he always had when he called me Red. I hadn't heard it in years, and yet here it was, crackling through the radio like a ghost from the past. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself it was just some weird interference. But the road ahead seemed to twist and shift unnaturally, like the mountains themselves were trying to trap us in. I checked my mirrors again, half expecting to see the ghost truck reappear. But there was nothing, just the thick, swirling fog. "Pete, something's not right," I said into the mic, trying to keep my voice steady. "We should stop. Let the fog clear." "Negative, Red. We've got a tight schedule. Keep moving." His response was sharp, almost panicked. Pete wasn't the type to scare easily, but I could hear the tension in his voice. He knew something was wrong too, but he didn't want to say it. The fog pressed in closer, and suddenly the road didn't feel familiar anymore. I'd driven this pass more times than I could count, but now it was like the route had changed. The turns were sharper, the drops steeper. I didn't know where we were headed anymore. And then I saw the truck again. It appeared out of the fog, closer this time, swerving wildly across the road. The old, rusted cab, the faded red stripe. It was Marty's rig, no doubt about it, but when I pulled alongside, there was no driver. The cab was empty, the windows fogged over from the inside. My stomach lurched. I slammed the brakes, swerving to avoid the ghost truck, but it vanished into the mist as quickly as it had come. My truck fishtailed, tires screeching against the wet pavement, but I managed to hold it steady. My heart was pounding in my chest. "Red, what the hell's going on back there?" Pete's voice snapped through the radio. "I saw him," I muttered, barely able to catch my breath. "I saw Marty's truck." Silence hung in the air for a long moment. I knew Pete was processing what I'd said, trying to figure out if I was losing it or if there was something more. But before he could respond, the CB crackled again. Marty didn't make it. It wasn't Pete, it wasn't Jerry, it was Marty. His voice filled the cab, clearer than before, as if he was sitting right next to me. "You let me go, Red? You let me fall." I clenched the wheel, anger and fear boiling in my chest. "I didn't let you fall. I tried, Marty. You didn't try hard enough." The road twisted again, sharper this time, and I could barely see the guardrail through the fog. But I kept driving, adrenaline coursing through me as Marty's voice echoed in my head. Suddenly, Pete's voice cut through the chaos. "Red, you gotta snap out of it. This isn't real. It's the mountains messing with you." I snapped back. "Messing with me? Don't act like you don't hear him, Pete." Pete didn't answer. The road ahead dipped sharply, and I saw it, the same curve where Marty had gone over. the same stretch of road where his truck had disappeared into the canyon. My heart raced, my mind spinning. Was that where this was leading? Was I about to relive Marty's crash? "Marty, I'm sorry," I whispered, gripping the wheel tighter as the road curved dangerously toward the edge. "I'm so damn sorry." The fog lifted just enough for me to see what was ahead. Marty's truck, in the middle of the road, blocking the pass. There was no time to stop, no time to think. I swerved hard, avoiding the ghost truck at the last second. My rig skidded, the wheels screeching as I fought to keep control. For a moment, I thought I was going over the edge. The wheels teetered on the lip of the canyon, the guardrail creaking under the weight of the truck. But I yanked the wheel, pulling the rig back onto solid ground. My breath came in ragged gasps. I looked in the rearview mirror. The ghost truck was gone. The fog was clearing, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. "Red?" Pete's voice came over the radio, softer now. "You still with us?" "Yeah," I whispered, gripping the wheel with trembling hands. "I'm still here." The mountains stretched ahead, empty and quiet. But I could still hear Marty's voice in the back of my mind, and I knew, in some way, he'd always be with me. We made it through the pass just as the sun broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the jagged peaks. The road ahead was clear, but I knew I'd never forget the night I'd faced Marty's ghost. I had been staring at the sinkhole for hours. The edges of the earth had crumbled away into a perfect jagged circle, leaving nothing but a gaping void beneath me. It was unnervingly symmetrical, as though the ground hadn't collapsed on its own, but had been carved out by something, or someone. I crouched at the edge, carefully adjusting my geological scanner, but the equipment was giving me nothing but static. The readings were all over the place. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, tapping the scanner in frustration. I hadn't come all the way to Hollow Creek for faulty data. I took a deep breath and scanned the horizon. The thick pines loomed like sentinels around the campground, their pale light of late afternoon casting long shadows across the landscape. My RV sat parked a short distance away, looking small and vulnerable against the vast wilderness of Chugach National Forest. It was a beautiful place, no doubt. Quiet, remote, exactly what I needed to clear my head. But the silence had a weight to it, an unnatural stillness that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I was here on a solo trip, tasked with investigating the sudden appearance of several sinkholes that had been forming in the area. Geological instability was the theory, but something about the way these holes formed had raised red flags from the moment I arrived. The patterns were too precise, too deliberate. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Ethan, the local park ranger, and the closest thing to human contact I'd had in days. His voice crackled through the static as I picked up. "Hey, Megan, how's it going out there?" "Not great," I admitted. "The equipment's glitching again, and these sinkholes, I don't know, they feel weird, not like anything I've seen before." Ethan chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Hollow Creek's always been strange. You wouldn't be the first to think something's off here." "What do you mean?" I asked, standing up and dusting off my jeans. "You ever hear the stories about this place? Locals believe the sinkholes are more than just geological shifts. They think there's something ancient beneath the earth. The indigenous people used to call it the land that breathes. They thought the earth here was alive, that it could swallow you whole if you weren't careful." I rolled my eyes, though the words stirred an uneasy feeling deep in my gut. Sounds like folklore to me. "Maybe," Ethan said, his tone serious now. "But I'd be careful if I were you. These woods have a way of playing tricks on you. And the sinkholes, well, they've taken people before. People who didn't listen to the warnings." I didn't respond right away, staring down into the abyss of the sinkhole in front of me. I'd studied rocks and underground formations for most of my career, but nothing had prepared me for the unnerving stillness of this place. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "But I'm here to study geology, not ghosts," Ethan sighed. "Just don't go too deep, okay? Call if you need anything." I hung up and pocketed the phone, but the conversation lingered in my mind. The land that breathes. Superstition, I told myself. Just old stories. I turned back to the sinkhole. Something inside me itched to see what was beneath the surface, to understand what was causing the ground to shift in such a strange, unnatural way. The patterns in the rocks I had been studying weren't like any natural formation I'd seen before. There were spirals, perfectly etched into the stone, as though by design, not by nature. The deeper I looked, the more I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't meant to find. That night, the first signs of trouble came in the form of noise, a low, deep rumbling that vibrated through the ground like the hum of a giant unseen machine. It started just as I was finishing dinner, sitting by the campfire. The sounds blended into the whispering wind at first, but then it grew louder, more distinct, like a deep pulse coming from below. I stood, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The stars were barely visible, shrouded in the thick clouds that seemed to roll in out of nowhere. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps, something moving in the dark. "Ethan?" I called, my voice small against the vast silence. Nothing. I walked toward the sinkhole, my stomach knotting with every step. The rumbling grew louder, and as I reached the edge, I felt it. Vibrations under my feet. The ground beneath me was shifting, alive. I shone my flashlight down into the hole, but the beam disappeared into the blackness, swallowed by the depths. I knelt, running my hand along the edge. The earth was soft, loose, as though it had only recently begun to settle after something had disturbed it. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I scrambled backward, heart racing, just as a section of the earth collapsed, sending a cascade of dirt and rocks into the sinkhole. I fell onto my back, gasping for air, watching as the hole grew wider, deeper, like a hungry mouth devouring the ground. Adrenaline pumped through me as I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a geological phenomenon. Something was moving beneath the surface. Something massive. I rushed back to the RV, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically as I fumbled for the key. But as I reached the door, the ground shook again, harder this time. The sinkhole was growing fast. I had to leave now. But then a thought struck me. What if I was right? What if this was something no one had ever discovered before? If I could just capture proof, if I could document what was really happening here, my work would be revolutionary. I would be vindicated. My mind flashed back to the spirals in the rock, the patterns that had seemed too deliberate to be natural. There was something ancient beneath the earth, and I was so close. I grabbed my gear and rushed back to the edge of the sinkhole. My heart pounded in my chest as I descended carefully into the darkness, lowering myself into the opening. The air grew colder as I went deeper. The walls of the hole were damp and slick beneath my hands. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom. The cavern was vast, much larger than I had anticipated. My flashlight illuminated jagged rock formations, but it was the carvings on the walls that caught my breath. Symbols, spirals etched deep into the stone. They were everywhere, ancient and deliberate. This wasn't just a natural formation. This was a structure, a temple of some kind, buried deep beneath the earth for centuries, maybe longer. I pulled out my camera, hands trembling, and began to record. But as I did, a low, resonating sound filled the cavern. A rhythmic pulse, like the beating of a massive heart. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, the ground shifting beneath my feet. And then, from the shadows, I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from the deeper recesses of the cavern. Something was moving toward me. Something massive. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the stone walls. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever was in the darkness, it was getting closer. I could feel its presence, a weight in the air, a primal force that made my skin crawl. The footsteps stopped, and then a deep guttural growl echoed through the cavern. I ran. I didn't look back. The ground trembled beneath me as I scrambled up the wall of the sinkhole, my hands slipping on the loose earth. The growling grew louder, closer, until I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. I burst out of the sinkhole, gasping for air, and ran toward the RV. The ground shook violently, and as I reached the door, I glanced back. The sinkhole was collapsing in on itself, the earth swallowing it whole. But for a split second, I saw something. Something massive, serpentine, rising from the depths before it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't wait. I threw open the door, started the engine, and sped away, leaving Hollow Creek behind me. By the time I reached the main road, my heart had finally begun to slow. I was alive. I had made it. But the images of that cavern, those symbols, haunted my mind. I had uncovered something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be found. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that should have stayed buried. Something that was still there, waiting beneath the earth. And I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be going back. I've always liked the quiet of the road. No one asking questions, no one poking into your business, just miles of highway, the hum of the engine, and the occasional crackle of a distant voice on the CB. But that night, somewhere on Route 50 in the middle of Nevada, the silence felt different. Too quiet, too heavy. It had been days since I'd had a decent break. I'd left San Francisco with a load of building materials bound for Kansas City, figuring Route 50 would cut the travel time. They call it the loneliest road in America, and I've driven it enough times to know why. For hours at a time, you don't see a soul, just endless desert dotted with mountains that never seem to get any closer. I was more tired than I wanted to admit, the kind of tired that sneaks up on you, where your eyelids grow heavy and the lines on the road start to blur. Normally, I'd push through, but something told me to pull over this time. I glanced at the clock and decided to hit the next rest stop I saw. A quick nap, I told myself, and I'd be good as new. I felt a wave of relief when I spotted the weathered sign for a rest stop 2 miles ahead. The stop wasn't marked on my map, which was odd, but these old highways have plenty of places that don't show up anymore. The place looked like it hadn't seen a decent coat of paint in a decade. The lights above the parking area flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. A beat-up picnic table and a few rusted trash bins were all that marked the stop. The restroom building sat off to the side, its windows dark, and the air around it felt heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I pulled the rig into the lot and killed the engine. Silence settled in around me, pressing through the windows. I leaned back in the driver's seat, rubbing my face. I just needed a few hours of sleep and I'd be good to go. But before I could settle in, nature called. Typical. With a sigh, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab. The night air was cold, much colder than I'd expected for Nevada, and the wind carried a strange scent, dry, with an underlying hint of something rotten. I wrinkled my nose, but kept moving toward the restroom. The building was worse up close. Graffiti covered the exterior, but it wasn't the usual stuff. No names or crude drawings. These were symbols. Spirals, triangles, strange geometric shapes I couldn't quite place. Some of them were carved deep into the wood, like they'd been there a long time. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me harder inside, stronger than before. I flicked the light on, but the bulb overhead just buzzed and flickered weakly. I turned on my flashlight and swept it across the room. The place was empty, as I expected, but the walls were covered in more of those symbols. Dozens of them, carved into the tiles, drawn on the mirrors. I did my business quickly, trying to ignore the feeling that those symbols were watching me, and made my way back out to the parking lot. That's when I saw the first figure. It was standing just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. A man in a heavy coat, his back to me, staring out into the desert. For a second, I considered calling out to him, but something about the way he stood there, so still, so quiet, made my gut twist. I stopped in my tracks, trying to decide if I should just get back in the truck and go. But the man didn't move. He didn't even seem to notice I was there. Maybe he was just another trucker, but I hadn't seen another rig on the road in hours. I took a step back toward my truck, keeping an eye on the figure. When I reached for the door handle, my fingers brushed something cold, too cold. I pulled my hand back, confused, and shone the flashlight on the handle. Symbols. Those same spirals and triangles scratched into the metal of my door. My heart started racing. I hadn't seen them there before. I would have noticed. I swallowed hard, scanning the lot, but the figure was gone, just vanished. I fumbled with the door, pulling it open and climbing back into the cab as fast as I could. I locked the doors and sat there, trying to steady my breathing, trying to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I'd driven across the country dozens of times, stopped in every kind of rundown, creepy rest stop imaginable, but nothing like this. The radio crackled to life suddenly, nearly making me jump out of my skin. For a second, I thought it was just picking up static, but then a voice broke through, low, distorted. Frank. My heart skipped a beat. I snatched the CB mic. Who is this? Silence. I stared at the radio, waiting, but the voice didn't come back. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the sound of my name, it was too clear. I glanced out the window again, half expecting to see the man in the coat, but the lot was empty. The only movement was the weak flicker of the overhead lights. Still, that rotten smell lingered, hanging in the air like a warning. I was about to start the engine and get the hell out of there when I noticed something in the rearview mirror. There was another figure now, standing near the restrooms. This one was closer. I couldn't make out their face in the dim light, but they were staring right at me, not moving, not blinking, just watching. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but when I reached for the ignition, the engine sputtered and died before it could even turn over. I tried again, nothing. The lights on the dashboard flickered weakly before going out altogether. "Come on," I muttered, trying to stay calm. "Don't do this to me now." I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal, no bars, no nothing. The figure was still there, closer now. Another figure appeared near the picnic table, and then another by the trash bins. They didn't approach, but they were closing in, little by little. My mouth was dry. I fumbled for the flashlight and shone it toward the restroom, hoping to get a better look at the figures. The beam of light cut through the dark, but when it hit the first figure, they were gone. Just gone. I swept the light across the lot, but all the figures had disappeared. Every single one. I didn't waste any more time. If my truck wasn't going to start, I'd fix it in the morning. For now, I just needed to get out of here on foot if I had to. I grabbed the toolbox from under the seat, just in case, and jumped down from the cab. That's when I noticed something else on the side of my truck. Etched into the paint was one of those symbols. Fresh. I could smell the metallic tang of scratched metal. It was the same spirals and triangles I'd seen in the bathroom, the same ones that had been on the door handle. The smell hit me again, stronger now. I turned, shining the flashlight toward the restroom, and that's when I saw it. The symbols were glowing. A faint, sickly light pulsed from the walls of the building, the carvings and scratches now alive with some kind of energy. The ground beneath my feet vibrated, a low hum building in my chest. I stumbled back toward the truck, my flashlight shaking in my grip, but the lights in the building grew brighter, casting long, flickering shadows across the lot. And then I heard the voice again. Frank. I whipped around, scanning the empty lot, but there was no one there, no figures, no man in the coat. Just the voice, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Frank, you need to stay. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I kept moving, trying to get back into the cab. But the symbols, they were on my truck now, glowing with the same eerie light. The handle felt like ice under my fingers. The wind picked up, howling across the lot, carrying whispers with it. Low, urgent voices layered on top of each other, impossible to understand, but they felt old, ancient. I was frozen in place, trapped between the truck and whatever the hell was happening in that restroom. The lights, the symbols, the voices. I didn't know what to make of any of it, but I knew one thing. I had to leave now. The truck groaned as I climbed back into the cab, and I turned the key one last time, praying it would start. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. Without another thought, I slammed the truck into gear and floored it out of the lot, the tires skidding on the cracked asphalt. The rest stop disappeared in the rearview mirror, the glowing lights and symbols fading into the distance. As I drove down the highway, my hands trembling on the wheel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. The silence of the road was back, but it wasn't the same. The weight of those symbols, the voice, it lingered, and I knew deep down that whatever was tied to that rest stop wasn't finished with me. I don't stop on Route 50 anymore, not after that night. Some places are better left in the past. I never wanted to take the job, not this one. But when the bills pile up and your savings start running dry, you do what you have to, even if it means going back to the place you swore you'd never see again. Dead Man's Pass. It was Eddie's death that did it. 15 years ago, I lost my brother on that road. His rig skidded off a curve and plunged into the canyon. I was driving a mile behind him when it happened. Saw the whole thing through my windshield like a damn nightmare unfolding in slow motion. I've never been the same since. I never could forgive myself for not doing more, not being there to help. That's how it goes in this life. You haul, you drive, you move forward, keep the past in the rear view. But it's never that simple, is it? I'm Hank Collins, but most people on the road know me as Rusty. Maybe it's the hair going gray, or maybe it's just the wear and tear of 30 years behind the wheel. I've spent most of my life running rigs, hauling everything from livestock to construction equipment. This time I was hauling heavy machinery for a mining outfit in Utah. Easy enough, or so I thought. The cargo didn't bother me. What bothered me was the route, Route 163, through the heart of Monument Valley, and then up through Dead Man's Pass, the very stretch of road where Eddie lost his life. I've avoided it for years, but I couldn't avoid it this time. The money was too good, and the job came at a time when I needed it most. The first sign that something wasn't right came when I crossed into the desert. The vast expanse of red rocks stretched out for miles, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. It should have been peaceful, almost beautiful, but there was something off. The radio cut out first, static, then silence. Not unusual out here, but it didn't sit right. The stillness felt heavy, oppressive, like the desert itself was holding its breath. As the sun slipped away completely, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, probably another trucker making the same route. But as the miles passed, those headlights didn't get closer. They stayed there, far back but steady, like whoever it was didn't intend to pass or fall behind, just keeping pace. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the road ahead. The canyon walls began to rise on either side of me, the road narrowing as I approached Dead Man's Pass. My hands tightened on the wheel, the familiar knot of tension growing in my chest. The road was winding, dangerous, with steep cliffs on one side and jagged rock on the other. I'd driven it 100 times before, but not since the night Eddie died. As I climbed higher, the truck started to act up. First, it was the brakes. They began to make a grinding noise that sent vibrations up through the cab. They were new, serviced just a week ago. No reason they should be failing. Then the engine sputtered, just once, but enough to make my heart jump. "Come on, Rusty," I muttered to myself. "Just keep moving, 1 mile at a time." But the truck didn't listen. The headlights behind me were still there, never getting any closer, never fading away. Something about it gnawed at me, a slow realization creeping in. I knew that truck. It was Eddie's. It couldn't be. Of course, Eddie's truck was a wreck at the bottom of the canyon, rusted and forgotten. But the make, the model, even the busted left headlight, it was all the same, and it was following me. I turned up the CB, hoping for some noise to drown out my thoughts, but all I got was static. My hands were sweating now, the wheel slick beneath my fingers. The canyon walls seemed to press in tighter as I reached the most dangerous curve, the very spot where Eddie went over the edge. My foot eased off the gas, but then the CB crackled to life, and a voice broke through the static. "Rusty, Hank, you gotta stop." I nearly jerked the wheel in shock. I knew that voice. It was impossible, but I knew it. It was Eddie. Eddie, I whispered, even though I knew there was no way it could be real. I fumbled with the radio, trying to clear the signal, but the voice only grew louder, swallowed by the hiss of static. Rusty, you gotta stop. You can't make the same mistake. I was losing my mind. That's what this was. Too many years on the road, too many ghosts haunting me. That's all it was. But then the truck sputtered again. The grinding in the brakes got worse. I could feel the whole rig shudder as I tried to slow down, but the brakes weren't responding. I pumped them hard, but nothing. The curve was coming up fast, and I knew I wouldn't make it if the brakes didn't hold. Damn it, I shouted, yanking the wheel hard to the right, pulling off onto the narrow shoulder. The truck screeched to a stop, just inches from the cliff's edge. For a long time I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the drop below. The canyon stretched out beneath me, a black abyss swallowing the last traces of daylight. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking, and then I saw it. Eddie's truck was still there, sitting on the road behind me, headlights glowing dimly through the dust. But now, I could see it wasn't just a truck. The rig was mangled, twisted, just like it had been after the accident. The front end was smashed in, the cab crumpled, the windshield shattered, and standing next to it was Eddie. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but he didn't disappear. He was there, as clear as day. His face was pale, gaunt, eyes hollow, but it was him. He was looking right at me. I stumbled out of the cab, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't know what I expected to happen, but I had to get closer. I had to see Eddie. My voice cracked as I took a step toward him. How are you? He didn't speak, just stared at me with those hollow eyes. Then slowly he raised a hand, pointing down the canyon. I followed his gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it. The wreckage of his truck lying at the bottom of the canyon, just as it had been all those years ago. No, I whispered. This can't be real. Eddie's voice echoed in my mind, though his lips didn't move. You gotta stop, Rusty. You gotta stop running. I fell to my knees, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I had run from this for so long, buried it deep, but now there was no escaping it. Eddie wasn't here for revenge. He wasn't here to haunt me. He was here because I'd never let him go. I'm sorry, I choked out, tears burning my eyes. I'm sorry, Eddie. It was my fault. I should have listened. I should have stopped. The wind howled through the canyon, and for a moment it sounded like Eddie was speaking again, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was forgiveness. I never blamed you, Rusty. His voice whispered softer now, like it was being carried away by the wind. But you got to forgive yourself. The headlights of Eddie's truck flickered once, then went out. The figure standing beside it began to fade, dissolving into the dust and shadows of the canyon. And then he was gone. I sat there on the edge of the road, staring down into the canyon where my brother's truck had fallen. The air was still, the only sound the soft hum of the desert wind. I didn't know how long I sat there, but when I finally got to my feet, something had shifted inside me. The guilt was still there, but it wasn't crushing me anymore. It wasn't tearing me apart from the inside. I could breathe again. I climbed back into the cab and started the engine. The truck roared to life, and the brakes responded this time, smooth and steady, as I pulled back onto the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. There was nothing there. No truck, no headlights, just empty miles of desert behind me. I smiled a sad, tired smile. It was time to stop running, time to go home. As I drove through Dead Man's Pass, the echoes of the past faded into the night, leaving only the road ahead. I hadn't planned on staying at Stillwater Grove. The campground wasn't even marked on my map, just a small patch of green near the edge of Shawnee National Forest. But as I drove down the empty forest road, I saw the sign. Old, weathered wood with the words Stillwater Grove Campground carved into it. It felt like an invitation, one I couldn't resist. I'd been on the road for weeks, photographing wildlife for a personal project I'd picked up after quitting my job. The last few months had been a blur of long drives, lonely campsites, and an overwhelming need to be anywhere but back in the city. I didn't miss my corporate job or my ex. What I did miss was the feeling that I knew what the hell I was doing with my life. Stillwater Grove seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, and right by the lake. It would give me the break I needed, some peace before heading back into the real world. When I pulled into the campsite, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grove. The air was still, the only sound being the gentle lapping of water against the shore. A single RV sat on the far side of the campground, a distant figure moving near it. Otherwise, it was just me. I parked my RV near the edge of the lake, the water glistening under the fading light. After setting up camp, I grabbed my camera and headed toward the shore, hoping to catch the sunset. As I stood there, framing the perfect shot, a voice startled me. Beautiful, isn't it? I turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, her face half in shadow. She had an otherworldly kind of beauty, pale skin, long dark hair, and eyes that seemed to take in everything. Yeah, I replied, lowering my camera. It's peaceful. She smiled. It always is here. I'm Ellie, by the way. Nick, I said, shaking her outstretched hand. Her skin was cold, like she'd been standing in the shade for too long. You camping here too? For a little while, she said, her voice soft. I come here every now and then. Can't stay away. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I wasn't used to talking to people much anymore. The solitude had become my comfort zone, and something about Ellie felt out of place. You here for the fishing? I asked, trying to make small talk. She shook her head. No, just the lake. The quiet. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, the water reflecting the colors like a mirror. I raised my camera, snapping a few shots, and when I looked back, Ellie was gone, just like that. I glanced around, but there was no sign of her. The other RV was still parked at the far end of the grove, but there was no movement. I chalked it up to her being quick on her feet, though it left me feeling oddly unsettled. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, making the trees outside rustle against each other like whispered secrets. I rolled over in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but something felt off. The RV was too cold, colder than it should have been. I checked the thermostat, but everything seemed normal. Still, the chill lingered. I grabbed a blanket and tried to force myself to sleep. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first, like a woman's voice carried on the wind. I sat up, listening, but it was gone. Just my imagination, I thought. Long days alone in the woods will do that to you. But then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a soft, melodic humming coming from outside. I climbed out of bed, grabbing my flashlight. My breath fogged up in the cold air as I stepped outside the RV, scanning the campsite. Nothing. Just the stillness of the lake and the trees swaying gently in the wind. But the humming persisted, coming from near the water's edge. I walked toward the shore, the beam of my flashlight dancing over the ground. And that's when I saw her. A woman in white, standing at the edge of the lake, her back to me. Her long, dark hair hung loose down her back, swaying slightly as she hummed that haunting tune. Ellie? I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't turn. She just stood there, motionless, her gaze fixed on the water. Something about the way she stood, so still, so rigid, set my nerves on edge. I took a step closer, the flashlight illuminating her pale figure. But as soon as the light touched her, she vanished. I blinked, stunned. 1 second, she'd been there. And the next, she was gone. The water rippled where she had been standing, but otherwise, the lake was empty. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was that? I hurried back to the RV, locking the door behind me. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps. My hands were shaking. I didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense, but what I'd seen, it wasn't right. I had seen her. I knew I had. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling, and trying to rationalize what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that woman standing by the lake. The next morning, I found Ellie near the grove, sitting by a small campfire. She smiled when she saw me, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Rough night? She asked, as if she already knew. Yeah, I said, sitting down across from her. I saw something last night. A woman by the lake. I thought it was you, but she wasn't there when you got close. Ellie finished, her voice calm, too calm. The Lady of Stillwater. The what? I asked, feeling a chill run through me. Ellie looked at me, her eyes dark and hollow. She's been here for a long time. Longer than the campground, longer than the trees. She drowned in the lake, or so the story goes. Some say she was waiting for someone. Her lover, I think, but he never showed. I stared at her, my stomach twisting. You're telling me she's a ghost? Ellie shrugged. Call it what you want, but she's real, and now that you've seen her, she won't let you go. I laughed, though it came out shaky. That's insane. Is it? Ellie asked, her gaze locking onto mine. You saw her. You know she's real. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. I had seen her, and it hadn't been a trick of the light or my imagination. Something had been there, something that shouldn't have been. What does she want? I asked quietly. Ellie's eyes flicked toward the lake. She wants what she's always wanted, to take someone with her into the water. That night, the sound started again. At first, it was the soft humming, drifting through the night air. Then the splashing, gentle, rhythmic, like someone wading through the water. I lay in bed, my heart racing, my body tense. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to see her again. But the pull was stronger this time. A strange compulsion tugged at me, drawing me toward the lake. I tried to fight it, to stay in the RV, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me outside into the cold night air. The lake was calm, reflecting the pale moonlight. And there she was, standing in the water, her white dress billowing around her as if moved by an unseen current. Come to me, she whispered, her voice soft but clear. Please come. I took a step forward, my body moving against my will. The water lapped at my shoes, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. Come with me, she said again, her voice almost pleading now. I've waited so long. I fought to resist, to break free from whatever force was drawing me in. But my feet kept moving, the water now up to my knees, freezing cold. I could feel the pull of the lake, the weight of the water dragging me down. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back with such force that I stumbled onto the shore. Ellie stood beside me, her face pale, her grip strong. You have to leave, she said, her voice urgent now. Before it's too late. I looked back at the lake, but the woman was gone. The water was still, as if nothing had happened. What the hell is happening? I gasped, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Ellie's expression was grim. She's marked you now. If you stay, she'll take you. You have to go. I didn't argue. I packed up my things, my hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Within minutes, I was back in the RV, starting the engine and pulling out of the campsite as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Ellie stood at the edge of the grove, watching me go, her face unreadable. And behind her, just barely visible in the mist, was the Lady of Stillwater, her pale eyes following me, waiting for me to return. I didn't look back again. My name's Brian Patel, and this happened to me in the National Forest in Oregon. I grew up in Portland and spent most weekends hiking the trails with my dad. After he passed away, I kept the tradition alive, even though the solitude wasn't quite the same. I wasn't the sentimental type, but being out there brought some quiet to my otherwise loud, chaotic life as an electrician. That particular weekend, and I'd planned a 2-day solo trek, something to clear my head and test out some new gear. I wasn't an ultralight fanatic or anything, but I liked keeping things minimal. Just me, the trail, and whatever nature threw at me. My route started at Timberline Lodge and cut through some backcountry trails that didn't see much traffic. It was early morning when I set out, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a map in the other. The first few hours were uneventful. The trails were damp from rain earlier in the week, and the scent of pine mixed with the occasional waft of mushrooms kept things pleasant. Around noon, I passed an older couple hiking with trekking poles. They waved but didn't stop to chat, which was fine by me. Solitude was the point. It was late afternoon when I noticed the first odd thing. I'd stopped at a clearing to refill my water from a nearby creek. The silence was too perfect. No birds, no rustling. Nothing. It wasn't unusual for animals to scatter when a human came stomping through, but this was eerie, like the forest was holding its breath. I joked to myself that maybe I'd finally reached that perfect peace people were always yapping about in self-help books. As I climbed higher into the denser part of the forest, the feeling lingered. Every so often, I'd hear a snapping twig or see a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, but I chalked it up to squirrels or deer. That changed when I reached the ridge. There was a campsite up there, or at least what was left of one. A collapsed tent lay flattened against the dirt, its poles bent at odd angles. Gear was scattered around like someone had emptied a backpack in a panic. What caught my attention was the cooler, one of those sturdy, bear-resistant kinds. Its lid was wrenched open, and deep claw marks gouged the plastic. I didn't recognize the pattern. It didn't look like bear claws. Whatever did it had talons. I poked around cautiously. A jacket with a name tag, Franklin, hung on a low branch, ripped down the middle like someone had tried to peel it off. That's when I saw the blood. Not a lot, but enough to know something had gone wrong. My stomach tightened. I didn't consider myself squeamish, but the combination of the silence and the blood made the air feel heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I didn't linger. I wasn't about to play hero and investigate further, but I also didn't want to turn back the way I'd come. The campsite had a bad vibe, and if someone was injured, I wasn't eager to meet whatever or whoever had caused it. I decided to push forward toward a secondary trailhead about 5 miles out. It wasn't on my original route, but it would get me out of there quicker. The trail narrowed as I descended into a gully. Thick undergrowth swallowed most of the light, and the temperature seemed to drop. My boots squelched in the damp earth as I pushed past ferns that slapped against my legs. About halfway down, I caught a foul odor, like rotting meat mixed with damp fur. My first thought was a dead animal, maybe a cougar kill left to rot, but it was strong enough to make my eyes water. Then I heard it, a low, deep rumbling noise that didn't sound natural. It wasn't a growl, but it wasn't mechanical either. It reverberated through the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint the direction. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I chose the third option, freeze. I crouched low, scanning the trees, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of heavy footsteps. I forced myself to move, creeping forward as quietly as possible. The trail curved ahead, and just as I rounded the bend, I saw it, or at least part of it. A massive, hulking shape loomed through the trees, crouched over something on the ground. Its limbs were grotesquely long, the joints bending in ways that didn't make sense. It had patches of wiry fur mottled with bare, pale skin. What struck me most was its posture, like a predator that had evolved to ambush. I stayed hidden behind a tree, trying not to breathe. Whatever it was feeding, its movements jerky and almost insect-like. The thing was tearing into something unrecognizable, its talons slicing through flesh with surgical precision. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to retch. The smell was overwhelming. A sudden snap of a branch underfoot betrayed me. The creature's head shot up, swiveling unnaturally as it scanned for the source of the noise. I didn't get a clear view of its face, but I did see its teeth, rows of uneven serrated spikes that looked like they belonged in a shark, not on land. I bolted. Stealth be damned, I sprinted down the trail, branches clawing at my face and arms. The sound of pursuit was immediate, heavy footfalls crashing through the undergrowth. I didn't dare look back. My pack jostled against my shoulders as I weaved through the narrow trail, adrenaline pushing me faster than I thought possible. The trail forked ahead, and I veered left without thinking. Bad move. The path led to a dead end, a sheer drop-off into a ravine. My options were limited. Jump and risk breaking something, or turn and face the thing head-on. Neither seemed appealing. I scrambled up a boulder, hoping to gain some height and buy myself time. The creature burst through the trees moments later, its gangly frame silhouetted against the dim light. Up close, it was worse. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, and its movements were unnervingly smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. It paused, tilting its head as if deciding whether I was worth the effort. I fumbled for the small knife in my pocket, knowing it was more symbolic than anything. The creature lunged forward, and I did the only thing I could. I threw my pack at it. The motion startled it, and it recoiled briefly, giving me enough time to leap down the side of the ravine. I tumbled hard, dirt and rocks tearing at my clothes as I slid to the bottom. My ankle twisted painfully, but I managed to scramble to my feet. The creature didn't follow immediately, but I could hear it pacing above, its claws scraping against the rocks as it searched for another way down. I limped through the ravine, following the trickle of water downstream. My only thought was to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. The ravine eventually opened up into a clearing, and I spotted a ranger's cabin in the distance. Relief surged through me, though it was tempered by the realization that I wasn't out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively. The cabin was locked, but I found an axe leaning against the woodpile. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I crouched low, gripping the axe and scanning the tree line. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. When it came, it was sudden. The creature barreled into the clearing, moving faster than seemed possible for its lanky frame. I swung the axe as it charged, catching it in the shoulder. The impact staggered it, but the thing didn't go down. It lashed out with its talons, grazing my arm and drawing blood. We circled each other, predator and prey, roles blurring. I swung again, aiming for its head this time. The blade connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature let out a piercing screech. It collapsed, twitching violently before going still. I didn't stick around to admire my handiwork. With my arm bleeding and my ankle screaming in pain, I limped back toward the trailhead, keeping an eye on the shadows. I flagged down the first car I saw, a bewildered couple who probably thought I'd lost my mind. Years later, I avoid Mount Hood. Not because I'm scared, but because I've learned to stick to places where nature follows the rules, or at least pretends to. I'm going to be honest with you. Being a cop in a small town isn't glamorous. It's not like the movies where every day is a shootout or a high-speed chase. It's mostly handling neighbor disputes over where someone's fence ends or someone's dog barking too much. My name's Lucas Giroux, and I've been wearing the badge for 9 years here in Chesterville, Louisiana. Population about 2,000, give or take. I love this town. It's quiet, peaceful for the most part, and I like that. My days are usually filled with mundane tasks, which suits me just fine. I didn't sign up to be some action hero, but that was before what happened in 2014. That night, everything changed. Chesterville sits on the edge of Lake Vere, a slow-moving body of water surrounded by cypress trees and swampland. People here fish, drink, and go about their lives. It was a pretty uneventful Thursday evening. I was sitting in the patrol car near the lake, enjoying the last of my coffee. That's when the call came through. Domestic disturbance, 14 miles out of town, near the edge of the bayou. Some old shack out there. Probably a drunk couple having a fight. I sighed, thinking about how cold my coffee was going to get by the time I got back. I could have ignored the call. In a town this small, people mostly resolve their issues on their own. But it's my job, and I'm not the kind of guy to leave a job half done. So I punched the gas and headed toward the edge of the swamp, the smell of rotting vegetation creeping into the car through the vents. The air always smells different out there. Heavy, like something's growing in the darkness. The address was off the main road, way off. I had to take a gravel path that was barely wide enough for my cruiser, with branches scraping against the sides like they were trying to keep me from going any further. The place was almost hidden behind thick trees, vines practically choking the building itself. It was an old, decaying wooden structure, more of a cabin than a house. When I stepped out of the car, everything felt wrong. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, but I shook it off. Maybe I was just on edge because it was so quiet. And in a town where quiet usually means safety, this felt different, like something was waiting. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. That's when I heard it, a scraping noise from inside, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I called out, "Chesterville PD, anyone home?" Still nothing. Now, I've dealt with drunks, domestic fights, and all sorts of noise complaints, but the sound coming from inside wasn't something I'd heard before. My hand instinctively went to my gun as I tried the doorknob. Locked. I circled the cabin, looking for another way in, when I noticed something strange, a set of footprints leading around the back. But not human ones. These prints were larger, clawed, like some kind of animal. But whatever made them was walking on two legs, and they were fresh. I was starting to think this wasn't just some domestic dispute. I followed the prints, feeling a chill in the pit of my stomach. As I reached the back of the cabin, I saw the door was ajar, hanging on its hinges. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. The cabin was small, just one room, with a dirty mattress on the floor and a table covered in old newspapers. But what caught my eye was the blood. It was smeared across the floor, thick and dark, leading to a corner where something was slumped. I shone the flashlight on it. It was a man, or what was left of him. His body had been torn apart, like he'd been mauled by something much bigger than any animal I'd ever seen in these parts. His chest was ripped open, ribs exposed, and his face, well, there wasn't much left to recognize. I barely had time to process the scene when I heard that same dragging noise again, but closer this time, coming from behind me. I turned, heart racing, and shone the light toward the sound. Something was moving in the shadows. Something big. At first I thought it was a bear, but bears don't move like that, and they sure as hell don't stand on two legs. It stepped into the light and I froze. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, with matted fur and a face that looked almost human, but twisted, distorted, like something halfway between a person and a wolf. Its claws were long, too long for anything natural, and its mouth was smeared with blood, teeth glistening like knives. I didn't hesitate. I drew my gun and fired, emptying the magazine into the thing's chest. But it barely flinched. The bullets hit, sure, but they didn't seem to do much more than piss it off. It let out this low sound, like it was irritated more than hurt, and took a step toward me. I backed up, reloading as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I've never been a great shot, but at this range, it didn't seem to matter. Nothing was going to stop this thing. It lunged. I dove out of the way, crashing into a shelf that sent bottles and cans scattering across the floor. My head was spinning, but I managed to scramble to my feet and run for the door. I don't know how, but I made it back to the car, slamming the door shut just as it slammed into the side of the cruiser, rocking it on its wheels. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the mud as I gunned it back down the gravel path. The thing didn't follow me. It just stood there in the rearview mirror, watching. As I sped away, its shape slowly faded into the darkness of the swamp. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I had to call it in. But what the hell was I going to say? That some kind of monster tore a man apart and nearly killed me? I thought about it for a long moment, staring at the radio, before deciding to do something I never thought I'd do. I lied. When I called it in, I said I found the man already dead. Looked like some kind of animal attack. Maybe a bear, maybe a wild dog. Hell, maybe both. I didn't mention the thing I saw. I couldn't. No one would believe me. I barely believed it myself. But here's the thing. I wasn't the only one out there that night. I found out later that 2 fishermen had been on the lake, close enough to the cabin to hear the gunshots. They saw something too. Something large, moving through the trees. They didn't get a good look at it, but they said it wasn't a bear. Wasn't anything they'd ever seen before. And they swore it walked on 2 legs. The next morning, I went back out there with the sheriff and a couple of deputies. We found the body, or what was left of it, but there was no sign of the creature. Just those same strange tracks leading off into the swamp. The sheriff wrote it up as an animal attack, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew something didn't add up. I've thought about that night a lot since then. about how close I came to ending up like that poor bastard in the cabin, and about what's still out there, lurking in the swamp. Some nights, when it's real quiet, I wonder if it's still watching. But I've learned not to go looking for answers. Sometimes, in a place like this, it's better to let the mysteries stay buried. My name is Kevin Scott. I was 32 years old when it happened. I'd been living out of my RV for the past 8 months, traveling across the country, writing about forgotten places and hidden gems. It was supposed to be an escape from my ex-wife, from my old life, from the custody battle I knew I was never going to win. This happened in Little Talbot Island, Florida. I picked the spot because it was quiet, off the beaten path, and beautiful in a way that most beaches weren't. No high-rises, no tourists, just rolling dunes, thick patches of forest, and the endless stretch of the Atlantic. Perfect for the kind of travel blog post I was planning. I pulled into the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the sand. The ranger at the entrance had given me a strange look when I told him I was camping alone. "Storm's coming in," he said, eyeing the darkening sky. "Might want to stay closer to town." I shrugged it off. A little bad weather didn't scare me. I'd been through worse. I parked the RV in a secluded spot near the dunes, set up my gear, and spent the evening taking photos. As the sky darkened, a thick mist rolled in from the water, swallowing the landscape. It happened so fast, like a wave crashing over the dunes. Within minutes, the world beyond my headlights was gone. That's when I saw them. 2 pinpricks of red light, barely visible through the fog, hovering just above the dunes. At first, I thought they were taillights from another camper's vehicle, but they didn't move. They just watched. I blinked, and they were gone. I laughed to myself. Probably just my imagination. I'd been on the road too long. That night, I locked the doors and stretched out on the tiny bed in my RV, listening to the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. But sleep didn't come easy. At some point, I heard something, a soft, rhythmic scraping. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound came from outside, right next to the RV. I reached for my flashlight and crept toward the window, moving slowly, carefully. My breath fogged up the glass. I saw footprints in the sand. Large, deep, they circled the RV, stopping right at the door. I yanked the curtain shut. The next morning, I found something else. A message carved into the sand just a few feet from my RV. "Don't run." The letters were long, jagged, like they'd been made with something sharp. I took a photo, my hands shaking. Maybe some was messing with me. Maybe this was a local trying to scare off outsiders. Or maybe it was something else. I spent the afternoon hiking the trails, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. I kept telling myself there was a logical explanation. The wind, the tide, my own paranoia. But then I found the tent. It was buried beneath the dunes, half collapsed, the fabric shredded. Inside there were old camping supplies, a torn sleeping bag, and a journal. The pages were damp, the ink smudged, but I could still read some of the entries. Something is watching me. Every night it gets closer. I saw the eyes again. They never blink. I tried to leave, but the tide. I keep walking in circles. I don't know if it's me or this place, but I can't find my way out. It waits until I'm too tired to fight. I can hear it breathing. I closed the journal and stood there, heart hammering. Had someone else been here before me? Had they gotten out? As the sun set, I made a decision. I was leaving in the morning. That night, the power in my RV flickered. The radio crackled, the station tuning itself. Static, giving way to something else. A voice. My own voice. "Stay, stay, stay." I lunged forward and turned the radio off. My reflection in the dark screen stared back at me. But for a split second, I swore. I swore I saw it blink. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. Something just outside, watching. At some point, I heard scratching. Not at the door. On the roof. Something was up there. I held my breath, gripping my pocket knife, listening as the slow, deliberate movement shifted above me, claws against metal. Then silence. Then a voice. My own voice, whispering from just beyond the RV. "Mike," I didn't move. "Mike, let me in." I pressed a hand over my mouth. It sounded exactly like me, like I was standing right outside. A shadow passed across the window. I didn't sleep after that. By sunrise, I was ready to go. I threw my things into the RV, turned the key. Nothing. The engine was dead. I sat there, breathing hard, trying to stay calm. I had jumper cables. I could fix this. I could get out. Then I heard footsteps, slow, dragging. I turned my head and saw them. The red eyes. Not just one pair. 3, 4, 5. They hovered above the dunes, blinking in and out of existence, moving closer. I grabbed my flare gun and bolted out the door. I ran, not toward the road, toward the beach. The tide was high, the waves crashing against the shore. If I could just make it to the water, maybe they wouldn't follow. Behind me, the footsteps grew faster. I turned, raised the flare gun, and fired. The light illuminated the dunes for just a moment, and I saw them. Tall, thin, moving wrong, like marionettes with their strings tangled. No faces, just those glowing red eyes. And long, gaping mouths. Then they screamed. The sound was worse than anything I'd ever heard. Worse than gunfire. Worse than sirens. Worse than the worst moments of my life. I turned and sprinted for the water. Then, nothing. The next thing I remember, I was in a fishing boat. An old man shaking me awake. "Jesus, son," he muttered. "What the hell were you doing out there?" I looked back at the shore, but the beach was empty, the dunes undisturbed. They were gone. Or maybe they had never left. I never went back for my RV. Never even tried. I didn't care about my gear, my laptop, my camera. Because when I checked my phone later, I found something that made my blood run cold. A photo. The last picture I had taken. Me, standing on the beach. And behind me, half visible through the mist, the red eyes, watching. I don't know what they are, but I know they're still there. My name is Bobby Stevens, and this happened to me back in 2000 in Juneau, Alaska, when I thought I'd figured out the best way to escape the chaos of city life. Buy a cabin off the grid, live like Thoreau, and grow an impressive beard. Turns out, I'm not exactly a survivalist, and that beard never really came in. I'd been living in that cabin for about 2 months, wrestling with basic tasks like chopping wood without chopping my foot and getting a fire started without fumbling through half a box of matches. But I liked the solitude, until I started hearing the hum. It wasn't every night, just sporadically. A low, mechanical thrum that vibrated in my chest like a subwoofer cranked too high. At first, I thought it might be the wind against the peaks or some kind of machinery echoing from the city miles away. I even made a joke to myself, maybe Sasquatch got a generator. That night, though, the hum became a roar. My cabin shook, not like an earthquake, but more like the structure itself was resonating. I stumbled outside, bare feet crunching on the frosty gravel, and that's when I saw it. Hovering over the tree line was something enormous, metallic, and, if I'm being honest, uglier than anything I'd ever imagined could fly. It wasn't sleek or aerodynamic, just a mass of haphazardly connected shapes, glowing with what looked like molten gold veins running through their hulls. It didn't zip or glide. It hovered, pulsating, as if deciding what to do next. And then it chose. A beam of light blasted down, not the kind that sweeps around like in old sci-fi movies, but sharp, focused, and immediate. Before I could duck or even think, I was in it, lifted clean off the ground like a rag doll. My first thought wasn't alien abduction. It was, this is the worst way to die, barefoot. The next thing I knew, I was inside. It smelled sterile, but not in a hospital way, more like someone had scrubbed everything with ammonia and forgot to rinse. The walls pulsed faintly, that same molten glow I'd seen outside, tracing patterns that seemed to shift the more I stared. I wasn't alone. There were 2 of them. The closest alien stood about 8'2", shaped like someone had stretched a human silhouette until it was all wrong. Thin as a rake, its limbs too long, with elbows that bent backward like a praying mantis. Its skin was textured like polished onyx, shimmering faintly under the light. The face, or what I assumed was the face, had no features, just smooth blackness. It looked at me, or at least turned toward me, and a voice filled my head, clear as if someone were speaking directly into my brain. "Do not be alarmed. You are unharmed. Yeah, I can see that, I blurted. Sarcasm apparently is my default even under threat of dissection. Nothing says unharmed like yanking someone out of their yard without consent. The alien tilted its head, almost like a dog hearing a strange noise, then spoke again. You are a sample. Analysis is required. Sample? Buddy, I'm not an Amazon return. The other alien, slightly shorter but bulkier, with limbs like an insect's exoskeleton, approached, carrying something that looked a lot like a scalpel. If scalpels came in 3 parts and vibrated. It didn't even try for pleasantries. It pressed the blade to my shoulder, and I howled. Not in pain, at least not physical, but in a sound that ripped through my thoughts. They weren't cutting my flesh. They were cutting into my mind. Images flashed, moments I barely remembered. A spelling bee I won in 3rd grade. My first failed attempt to ask someone to prom. The time I accidentally set the toaster on fire trying to melt marshmallows. Each memory felt like it was being yanked out, examined, then tossed aside. Stop it! I screamed, but my voice barely echoed in the chamber. The taller alien responded. Your species' resilience is sufficient. Behavioral anomalies detected. Behavioral anomalies? I shouted. I cried during Homeward Bound. That doesn't make me an anomaly. The shorter alien finally spoke, or at least communicated, but its tone was harsher, angrier, like static interrupting a bad signal. You are defective. Others will replace. I didn't like the sound of replace. Before I could overthink it, I lunged, swiping at the shorter alien with pure, stupid adrenaline. My hand connected with its strange scalpel, sending it flying across the chamber. The taller alien responded instantly, extending its unnervingly long arms to pin me. Except I wasn't having it. I twisted, bringing one knee up into what I prayed was its weak spot. It crumpled slightly but didn't let go. You will not interfere, it declared, its voice pressing into my skull like a migraine. Yeah? Watch me, I spat. The chamber shifted suddenly, lurching sideways as if the entire ship had been struck. Alarms blared, a sound more grating than any fire drill I'd ever suffered. The shorter alien hissed something incomprehensible, rushing toward a panel covered in glowing symbols. That's when I spotted them. Cages. Lining the wall behind me were dozens of transparent containers, each filled with human bodies, limp but breathing. Some were kids, others elderly, most somewhere in between. My stomach twisted. These weren't just samples. These were people. Release them, I yelled, yanking against the taller alien's grip. It ignored me, focused on whatever crisis the ship was facing. The moment its grip slackened, I bolted toward the cages, searching for any way to open them. My hands fumbled against a panel covered in alien symbols, slapping buttons wildly. I must have hit the right one because the cages hissed open and bodies started sliding out to act like they'd been spit up by the machine. Not all of them woke up. The ones that did stared at me, their eyes wide and unfocused, as if their minds hadn't fully reconnected to their bodies. One man, a middle-aged guy with a scraggly beard, grabbed my arm and muttered, "Where? What?" "No time," I barked. "We're getting out of here." The shorter alien screeched, a sound so high-pitched it felt like my skull might split. It lunged toward us. But this time, I was ready. Grabbing the closest thing I could, a chunk of metallic tubing, I swung it with everything I had. The impact sent the alien staggering backward, black ichor dripping from what I assumed was its arm. "Move," I shouted, shoving the freed captives toward what looked like an exit. The taller alien intercepted us, its limbs extending unnaturally to block the path. The shorter one was recovering, its vibrating blade back in hand. Desperation kicked in. I didn't have a plan. Just raw panic and the kind of reckless courage that comes from having absolutely nothing to lose. I hurled the tubing at the taller alien, then dove toward the control panel where the shorter one had been working. Symbols glowed and flickered, and I jabbed at them, praying I wasn't about to blow us all to smithereens. The ship jolted violently, tilting us sideways. The shorter alien screeched again, its blades skittering across the floor. One of the freed captives, a wiry teenager, grabbed the weapon and drove it into the alien's chest. Black liquid sprayed. The creature collapsed, twitching. "Gross," the kid muttered, tossing the blade aside. The taller alien turned toward the chaos, momentarily distracted. I seized the chance, slamming another button on the panel. A hatch opened behind us, revealing a tunnel of blinding white light. "Run!" I screamed. We dove through, one by one, tumbling onto cold, rocky ground. Behind us, the ship shuddered, emitting a deafening hum, before it shot skyward, vanishing into the night. We weren't alone. Bodies littered the forest clearing, some mangled beyond recognition, others eerily pristine. The survivors stared in stunned silence, the weight of what we had just escaped sinking in. Later, investigators swarmed the area, documenting the carnage. Autopsies revealed surgical scars and strange metallic implants in the deceased. Authorities claimed it was a cult gone wrong, a mass delusion fueled by hysteria. They didn't believe us. But I saw the symbols, the cages, the ichor-stained blade. And I know this. Whatever those things were, they weren't done collecting. My name is Kevin Scott. I'm 31 years old, and I swear to God, everything I'm about to tell you is real. It happened 2 years ago in the middle of Green Swamp Wilderness Preserve, Florida. I wish I had listened to the warning. It started as a weekend trip, just 4 of us. Me, my old army buddy Travis, my best friend Ryan, and his girlfriend Jessie. Ryan was obsessed with urban legends, always chasing cryptid stories and internet horror nonsense. He had been talking for weeks about La Bruja, a swamp witch that supposedly haunted the backwoods of Florida, stealing souls and driving people insane. I should have told him to shut up and pick a normal vacation spot. We set off in Travis's beat-up RV, a clunky relic that rattled like a tin can every time we hit a pothole. The trip was supposed to be fun. Campfires, fishing, and beers under the stars. Just some time away from the city. Instead, it became the worst night of my life. The first sign of trouble came before we even got there. At a gas station just outside the swamp, an old man sitting on the porch stared at us like we were already dead. He spat into a tin cup and said, "Y'all ain't got no business out there." Ryan, grinning like an idiot, asked if he believed in the stories. The old man's face darkened. Once you hear the singing, it's already too late. Travis laughed it off. Jessie rolled her eyes. I felt something tighten in my chest. We drove into the wilderness, deeper than I liked. No cell signal, no GPS. After a while, just miles of swamp, trees like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. It was nearly sunset when we finally parked the RV in a clearing by the water. The first thing I noticed? The silence. No birds, no bugs, not even the hum of mosquitoes. Just dead air, thick with humidity and something I couldn't name. We set up a fire, cooked some canned chili, and cracked open a few beers. The tension eased. Even I started to relax. Then, just after midnight, Ryan disappeared. I woke up to Jessie shaking me. "Kevin, Scott's gone." The fire was just smoldering embers, casting long shadows on the trees. Travis sat up, groggy, rubbing his face. We found Ryan's boots and clothes neatly folded on a log near the water. His camera was still there, turned off. No tracks leading away. No sound. Jessie panicked. "We need to look for him, now." "Hell no," I said. "We wait until morning. We don't go into the swamp at night." But she wasn't listening. She grabbed a flashlight and stormed off. Travis and I had no choice but to follow. The deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. The trees started to look the same, like we were walking in circles. My watch said 2:14 a.m., but the moon hadn't moved. Then we heard it, a woman humming, soft, eerie, like an old lullaby. Travis froze. "That ain't Jessie." The light from Jessie's flashlight flickered in the distance. She screamed. We ran toward her, found her standing in a knee-deep pool of water, shaking. I saw him. "Ryan?" She nodded. "He was standing right there. But his eyes were black, pitch black. He smiled at me." I turned my flashlight on the water. Nothing, just ripples. Travis grabbed my arm. "Kevin," I turned. A woman was standing in the trees. She was impossibly tall, skin stretched tight over her bones. Her face was wrong, her mouth too wide, her fingers too long, and her eyes, black pits, empty. She smiled. The flashlight died. Something yanked Travis into the water. He screamed, thrashing as unseen hands pulled him under. I lunged, grabbed his arm. Jessie screamed beside me. I pulled hard. Something let go. Travis gasped, coughing up swamp water, but his back was covered in deep claw marks, bleeding through his shirt. We ran. Somehow, we made it back to the RV. We barricaded ourselves inside, locked the doors, closed the curtains. Jessie sobbed. Travis groaned in pain. I checked the gashes on his back. They weren't just wounds. They were symbols. Then Ryan knocked on the door. Jessie moved to unlock it, but I grabbed her wrist. "Look at his eyes," I whispered. Through the window, I saw him standing in the moonlight, smiling, too wide, his black eyes gleaming. "Let me in, guys," he said. His voice layered, his and something else. Jessie broke. "It's him. We have to let him in." Travis, still weak, just muttered, Don't. I grabbed my knife. Ryan kept knocking, louder, then pounding. I stepped forward, gripping the handle, my heart slamming in my chest. Then Ryan stopped. Silence. I peeked out the window. Gone. We didn't sleep. Every few minutes I swore I heard whispering outside, soft laughter, scratching on the walls. Around dawn, Jessie had had enough. She grabbed a backpack. "I'm going for help." I grabbed her arm. "No, you're not." She shook me off. "I can't stay in here, Kevin. I can't." She ran outside before I could stop her. She screamed. I bolted after her. Nothing. Just her flashlight on the ground. She was gone. Vanished. Travis and I sat there in stunned silence. I wanted to cry, to scream, but I couldn't. Then Ryan came back. He walked right out of the trees, smiling, naked except for his jeans. His eyes normal again, his voice his own. "What's wrong?" he asked. "You guys look like you've seen a ghost." Travis whispered, No. I clenched my knife. "Where's Jessie?" Ryan tilted his head. "Who's Jessie?" My stomach dropped. Travis lost it. He grabbed a tire iron and swung at Ryan, but Ryan moved too fast, too fluid. He caught the iron mid-swing. Smiled. "Don't do that, buddy." I grabbed Travis and dragged him back toward the RV. We locked the door, boarded up the windows with what little we had left. Ryan sat outside, just sat there, smiling, and night fell again. Travis stopped responding. He was burning up, feverish, and then the humming started again. Ryan started laughing. I heard Jessie's voice whisper through the walls. "Kevin, let me in." I closed my eyes, held my breath. At some point, Travis stopped breathing. Morning came. Ryan was gone. Travis was cold. I didn't wait any longer. I ran through the swamp, not stopping, not caring what was behind me. I ran until I saw a road. A trucker found me, half crazed, covered in mud and blood. They never found Travis's body, or Jessie's. They did find the RV, though. The doors ripped off. The inside, covered in deep claw marks. And Ryan? He was on the news a week later, found wandering near the swamp. No memory of what happened. He doesn't remember me. But sometimes I wake up at night and I hear the humming. My name is Timothy Perez, and in 2015, I ventured to Isle Royale in Michigan to escape the bustle of city life. I'd always been the kind of guy who preferred the whisper of the trees over the honking of horns, and this remote island seemed like the perfect getaway. I arrived on a chilly morning, the kind where your breath fogs up like a bad magic trick. The ferry ride over Lake Superior was uneventful, save for an older gentleman who warned me about the island's unpredictable weather. "If you don't like it," he chuckled, "just wait 6 minutes." I laughed it off, thinking I'd heard that joke in every town I'd ever visited. Isle Royale was everything I hoped it would be. Dense forests, crystal clear lakes, and trails that seemed to stretch on forever. I set up camp near Rock Harbor, not far from where the ferry had dropped me off. The plan was simple. Hike, take photos, and maybe find some inspiration for the novel I'd been pretending to write for years. You know, the one where the hero saves the world and gets the girl, all while maintaining perfect hair. On my second day, I met a group of hikers, Tom, Lisa, and their teenage son, Max. They were from Chicago and had that Midwestern friendliness that makes you feel like you've known them for years. We exchanged pleasantries, and they invited me to join them for dinner at their campsite. Never one to turn down free food, especially when my options were dwindling packets of instant noodles, I gladly accepted. As we sat around the campfire that evening, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories, Tom shared tales about the island's wildlife. "They say the wolves here are some of the most elusive creatures you'll never see," he said, poking the fire with a stick. "Maybe they're just introverted," I quipped. "Can't blame them for wanting some peace and quiet." Max rolled his eyes. "Dad thinks every rustle in the bushes is a wolf waiting to pounce." "Better safe than sorry," Lisa interjected, smiling warmly. The night sky was a canvas of stars, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Little did I know that would be the last time things felt normal. The next morning, we decided to hike together to Mount Ojibwe, one of the island's higher points, promising breathtaking views. As we trekked through the forest, conversations flowed easily. Max complained about not having seltzers. Tom told another one of his infamous dad jokes. Why don't oysters donate to charity? Because they're shellfish. And Lisa kept us all in line with her motherly charm. About halfway up, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned ranger station. It looked like it hadn't seen maintenance since flip phones were cutting-edge technology. Curious, we decided to take a look inside. The door creaked ominously. Classic horror movie stuff, I know. The interior was sparse. A broken chair, a desk with outdated maps, and a musty smell that could have been bottled and sold as ode to neglect. Max found a faded journal tucked in a drawer. Flipping through it, his face paled. "Listen to this," he said. June 5th, 1998. Sightings of an unknown animal have increased. Rangers advised to travel in pairs. 2 hikers reported missing. Probably just old campfire stories, I suggested, trying to lighten the mood. Or maybe the previous ranger had an overactive imagination. Tom shrugged. Still, maybe we should stick together. Safety in numbers, right? We continued our hike, but the atmosphere had shifted. The forest seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. Even the birds had ceased their chatter. I joked that they must be on a union-mandated break, but no one laughed. Reaching the summit, the view was as spectacular as promised. Lake Superior stretched out endlessly, its waters glistening under the midday sun. We ate lunch in relative silence, the earlier unease still lingering. On our way back, we noticed something odd. The forest floor, which had been carpeted with leaves and twigs, now showed signs of disturbance. Deep gashes marred the trees, and patches of ground looked as though they'd been clawed by something large. Probably a bear, Tom speculated, though his voice lacked conviction. Do bears even live on this island? Lisa asked, her eyes wide. Mostly wolves and moose, I replied, but I've never heard of moose doing this. Max snapped a few pictures. Maybe we'll go viral, he said, attempting a grin. Teen documents mysterious forest creature. Click here to find out what happens next. Let's keep moving, Tom suggested, picking up the pace. As we neared the split where we'd go our separate ways, me back to Rock Harbor, them to their campsite, Tom placed a hand on my shoulder. You sure you don't want to join us for dinner again? I smiled. Thanks, but I think I'll turn in early tonight. Besides, I can't mooch off you guys forever. Lisa handed me a walkie-talkie. Just in case. Channel 6. We'd feel better knowing we can reach you. I accepted it gratefully. Thanks. I'll be fine. What's the worst that could happen? We parted ways, and I headed back to my tent. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that danced eerily among the trees. I told myself I was being ridiculous. After all, I came here to escape stress, not invent new reasons for it. Settling into my tent, I decided to review the photos I had taken. Scrolling through the images, one caught my eye. It was from the summit, a panoramic shot. But there, among the trees, was a dark shape that hadn't been there before. Zooming in didn't help. It only made the image grainier. Probably just a trick of the light, I muttered. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. Nothing out of the ordinary. I crawled into my sleeping bag, grateful for its warmth. Sometime later, I awoke to a faint crackling sound. At first I thought it was rain, but the sky had been clear. Then I smelled it. Smoke. Unzipping my tent, I peeked outside to see a small fire burning near the tree line. That's not supposed to be there, I thought. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously approached. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a random blaze. It was a campfire. Around it lay scattered belongings. A backpack, a hat, a hiking boot. No signs of people, though. Hello? I called out. Anyone there? Silence. I noticed the backpack had a name tag, Kevin Moore. Rifling through it seemed invasive, but I was concerned someone might be hurt. Inside, I found the usual, water bottle, trail mix, a map, but also a journal. Flipping it open, the last entry read, "Something is following me. I can hear it at night. If anyone finds this." A chill ran down my spine. Not the figurative kind people write about, but a genuine, icy dread. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. I decided to head back to my tent when the radio crackled. Just then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, echoing through the forest. It was human, filled with terror, and abruptly cut off. I sprinted back to my campsite, hands shaking as I fumbled with the walkie-talkie. Tom, Lisa, do you copy? Tom? Max? Anyone? Finally, a crackling response. Timothy, What's going on? I heard a scream near my camp. Found someone's gear, but no person. Something's not right. Stay put. We're on our way, Tom replied. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. I kept the flashlight beam moving, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, in the periphery of the light, I saw it. A massive silhouette lurking between the trees. It moved with a fluidity that was unnerving for something its size. I pointed the flashlight directly at it. The creature resembled a wolf, but stood upright like a human. Its fur was a mottled mix of grays and blacks. Its snout was elongated, teeth glinting as it snarled, eyes fixed on me. It let out a sound that was somewhere between a howl and a roar. My mind raced. This can't be real, I thought. Did someone spike my trail mix? Fight or flight kicked in, and flight won by a landslide. I bolted in the direction I hoped was toward Tom and Lisa. Behind me, I heard the creature crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground despite my adrenaline-fueled sprint. Ahead, I saw the beam of another flashlight. "Timothy!" Perez's voice shouted. "Run!" I yelled. "Go back!" But it was too late. The creature lunged between us, grabbing Max with clawed hands. He screamed as it dragged him into the darkness. "Max!" Lisa shrieked, dropping to her knees. Tom grabbed her arm. "We have to move!" I stood there, paralyzed by shock. Tom shook me. "Timothy, we need to get to safety now!" We stumbled through the forest, the creature's guttural sounds echoing behind us. Reaching a rocky outcrop, we wedged ourselves into a narrow crevice. The creature couldn't fit but clawed at the entrance, its razor-like nails scraping against the stone. Lisa was sobbing uncontrollably. Tom held her, his face a mask of despair. "We have to do something," I whispered. "And what do you suggest?" Tom snapped. "Offered a s'more?" Despite the dire situation, a hysterical laugh bubbled up. "I always knew camping was a bad idea," I muttered. "Next time, I'm sticking to Netflix and chill." "Assuming there is a next time," Tom retorted. Hours seemed to pass as we huddled together. The creature eventually retreated, but we could hear it pacing nearby, waiting. "We can't stay here forever," Lisa whispered. "At dawn, we'll make a run for the ranger station," Tom decided. "Assuming that place is still standing," I added. Morning light filtered in, and the forest took on an almost serene appearance, betraying the horrors of the night. We cautiously emerged, every snap of a twig making us jump. The trek to the ranger station was tense but uneventful. When we arrived, the place looked as abandoned as before, but it was our only hope. Inside, we found an old radio. Tom fiddled with it. Come on, he urged. Static." Then a voice. "This is Ranger Dispatch. Identify yourself." "Help, we're at the old ranger station on Isle Royale. Something attacked us. Our friend is missing," Tom blurted out. "Stay where you are. We're dispatching a team," the voice replied. Hours passed, each minute stretching longer than the last. Suddenly, the door burst open. Not rescuers, the creature. It had tracked us. It lunged at Tom, who tried to fend it off with a rusted fire poker. "Get Lisa out of here," he shouted. I grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her toward the back door. "We can't leave him," she protested. "We don't have a choice." As we stumbled outside, a gunshot rang out. Startled, we turned to see Tom standing over the creature, a flare gun in his hands. The beast writhed on the floor, momentarily incapacitated. "Didn't think that would actually work," Tom said, breathing heavily. We didn't waste time celebrating. Together, we ran toward the shoreline, hoping to signal any passing boats. Reaching the water's edge, we waved frantically as a ferry appeared in the distance. Behind us, the creature emerged once more, smoke still rising from its singed fur. It was wounded but relentless. "Keep going," Tom urged. As the ferry drew closer, a group of park rangers aboard spotted us. And the creature. They shouted orders we couldn't make out, but their raised rifles were a welcome sight. A volley of shots rang out. The creature let out a final, agonized howl before collapsing. The rangers escorted us onto the ferry. One of them, a stern-looking woman named Officer Delgado, questioned us about the incident. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "We've had reports of missing hikers, but nothing concrete until now." "What was that thing?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Delgado exchanged glances with her team. "We've got some theories, but nothing official. The island has its secrets." Back on the mainland, we gave our statements to the authorities. They assured us they'd investigate further, but something in their eyes told me they weren't expecting to find anything. A week later, news reports surfaced about the discovery of remains on Isle Royale, bones that didn't quite match any known species. Experts were baffled, speculating everything from undiscovered wildlife to elaborate hoaxes. As for Max, he was never found. A memorial service was held, but closure remained elusive. In the end, the island was closed to the public indefinitely. Official statements cited environmental concerns, but we knew better. I returned to city life, as the noise and crowds now a strange comfort. Occasionally, I'd catch myself scanning the headlines, looking for any mention of unexplained events in remote places. One day, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a journal, the same one I'd found at the abandoned camp. How it got to me, I had no idea. Attached was a note. "Thought you might want this, Officer Delgado." Flipping through the pages, I noticed new entries in handwriting that wasn't mine. They detailed sightings of creatures across various national parks, all eerily similar to what we'd encountered. It seemed the island wasn't the only place hiding secrets. I closed the journal and stared out the window at the cityscape. Maybe isolation wasn't the escape I thought it would be. My name is Austin Gibson. I'm 42 years old, and I swear on everything I have left that what happened in Apalachicola National Forest was real. I don't drink anymore. I can't, because every time I do, I see that thing's face grinning back at me in the dark. I drove my old RV into the forest a few years ago, thinking I needed some time alone after the divorce. I wasn't sleeping much. My hands shook if I wasn't holding a beer. My ex-wife Lisa said I needed help, but what I needed was space. Silence. So I packed up took a few cases of whiskey, and drove out to the deepest part of Apalachicola, where no one would bother me. The road was bad, worse than I expected. The deeper I went, the more the trees closed in, thick moss hanging from the branches like dead fingers. I didn't see another car for miles. That's how I wanted it. Just me, the swamp, and enough liquor to make me forget why I was out there in the first place. I found a clearing near the water and parked. No cell service, no radio reception, just the sound of frogs and the occasional rustling in the brush. The air was thick, humid as hell, and the sun was already sinking. The first thing that went wrong was the RV's battery. I killed the engine, went outside to take a leak, and when I came back, the lights wouldn't turn on. No power, no reason for it either. The damn thing had been fine all the way there. I figured I'd deal with it in the morning. That night, I sat by the fire, drinking, trying not to think about Lisa or the divorce, or the fact that I had nowhere to go when I got back. Then the knocking started. Soft, like fingertips against the metal. I turned my head slowly toward the RV. Nothing. Probably a branch, I told myself. Or an animal. I went inside, locking the door behind me. I lay down on the small cot, listening. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. It was coming from the other side now, near the back window. I grabbed my flashlight and yanked open the curtain. Nothing but darkness. I shut the curtain, turned over, and tried to sleep. At some point in the night, the radio turned on. It hadn't worked in years. The damn thing was busted, fried from an old battery issue. But now it crackled with static. And through it, a song started playing. Lisa used to love that song. But the lyrics were wrong. The voice singing was off, slow, stretched, like someone mimicking a record player at half speed. I yanked the power knob. The music stopped. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went outside to check the engine. That's when I saw the footprints. Not mine. They circled the RV, stopping right outside my window. Bare footprints, too long, like the toes had been stretched out. I told myself it was some local screwing with me, someone trying to scare me off. I decided I'd had enough of that spot, so I packed up to leave. Got in the driver's seat, turned the key. Nothing. The RV wouldn't start. I opened the hood, checked the wires. Everything looked fine, but it was like the engine was just dead, like the damn thing had given up. I was stuck. That's when I saw the man in the trees, far off, just standing between the pines, his head tilted, watching me. I called out, but he didn't move. I took a step forward. "Hey, buddy, you lost?" He took a step back, fading into the shadows. I ran toward where he had been, but by the time I got there, the trees were empty. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. I went back to camp, locking myself in the RV even though I knew that wouldn't do much. I spent the rest of the day trying to fix the engine, trying to find some rational explanation. Then the knocking came back. But this time, it was coming from the door. I froze. Knock, knock, knock. I swallowed hard, gripping the handle of my knife. Who's there? Silence. Then a voice. Low calm. Danny. My breath hitched. Lisa. I backed away from the door. The handle rattled. Danny, let me in. My hands shook. My head felt light. I hadn't spoken to Lisa in weeks. She wasn't here. She couldn't be here. I peeked out the window. She was standing there. Lisa, in the blue dress she wore the night she left me. Her hair down. Her lips curled in that soft little smile she used to give me when we were happy. I squeezed my eyes shut. I was hallucinating. The booze, the stress, that was all it was. When I opened my eyes, she was closer, right outside the window, smiling, too wide, her lips curled back, revealing too many teeth. I screamed and threw myself back. The knocking stopped. I didn't open the door. I didn't sleep. The next day, I tried to hike out. No matter how far I walked, I always ended up back at the RV. By sunset, I was losing my mind. Then the park ranger showed up. He came walking down the path like nothing was wrong, clipboard in hand. You lost, sir? I ran up to him. Jesus, man, you gotta help me. My RV's dead. Then I saw his badge. Holloway, my last name. I stepped back. What the hell? He just smiled. You're not supposed to be here, Danny. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, but no matter which way I went, I always ended up back at that damn RV. That night, the radio came on again. This time, it wasn't music. It was a voice, deep, laughing. You're almost ready to let go. I covered my ears. Shut up. Shut the hell up. The mirror in the RV cracked, and my own face smiled back at me. Danny, it whispered. You know why she left. I backed away, shaking. No. You were driving drunk. The air went out of my lungs. You crashed. I shook my head. No, she left me. My reflection grinned wider. She didn't leave. She never left. And then I remembered. The rain that night, the headlights spinning, the crunch of metal. I never called the cops. I passed out, woke up in the wreckage, stumbled home, convinced myself she'd just left. But she was still out there, somewhere in the swamp, buried. I fell to my knees, my head in my hands. The voice whispered in my ear, you can stay here, Danny, or you can let go. I don't know what made me do it, but I grabbed the bottle of whiskey and smashed it against the RV's floor. I lit a match. The fire spread fast. The voice screamed. The last thing I saw before I passed out, Lisa, standing in the flames, smiling. I woke up on the side of the road. My truck was there. The road was dry. The sky was clear. I drove out of that forest and never looked back. But sometimes, at night, I hear the knocking. And when I look in the mirror, I see my own face, smiling back. My name is Randy Smith, and back in 2018, I decided to take my RV up to Lake Superior Provincial Park in Ontario for some peace and quiet. Being cooped up in the city was starting to make me feel like a sardine in a can, and I figured some fresh air might do me good. Besides, I've always believed that nature and I have an understanding. I don't bother it, and it doesn't bother me. I've never been the rugged outdoorsman type. My idea of hiking involves a well-marked trail and a picnic at the end. But the allure of the open road and the promise of solitude were too tempting to pass up. So I packed my essentials, a week's worth of snacks, a stack of books I'd been meaning to read, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. The drive was picturesque, with the trees flaunting their autumn colors like they were showing off. By the time I reached the park, the sun was casting golden hues over the lake, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I found a secluded spot near the water, set up camp, and made myself a cup of coffee. This isn't so bad, I thought. Maybe I should write a book, Randy's Adventures in the Wild. As dusk settled, I decided to light a campfire. There's something hypnotic about watching flames dance. It's like nature's television. I was roasting marshmallows, because what's a camping trip without s'mores? When I heard footsteps crunching leaves behind me. Evening, a voice said. I turned to see a man standing at the edge of my campsite. He was tall and gaunt, with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they'd been through a war zone. His eyes had a peculiar glint, one that made me instinctively uneasy. Evening, I replied cautiously. Can I help you with something? Just passing through, he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Name's Jedediah, but folks call me Jed. Randy, I offered, though he hadn't asked. Beautiful night, isn't it? He stepped closer, eyeing the marshmallows. Sure is. Mind if I join you for a bit? Every alarm bell in my head was ringing, but I didn't want to be rude. Actually, I was just about to turn in, long drive and all. He tilted his head, the smile fading. Fair enough. You take care now. Will do, I said, watching as he disappeared into the shadows. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Well, that wasn't creepy at all, I muttered, deciding it was indeed time to call it a night. I extinguished the fire and secured the RV. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of pine. I convinced myself that I'd overreacted the night before. Maybe Jed was just a harmless drifter. After breakfast, I decided to explore a nearby trail. I left a note on the dashboard, a habit from watching too many true crime shows, grabbed my backpack, and set off. The trail was serene, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and leaves crunching underfoot. I was about an hour in when I noticed something odd, a campsite just off the path. But it looked abandoned. Curious, I ventured closer. Tents were collapsed, and belongings were strewn about as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Unease settled in my stomach. This is how people end up in horror movies, I joked nervously to myself. I decided to head back. As I turned, I nearly bumped into Jed. Whoa, you startled me, I exclaimed. Sorry about that, he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. What brings you here? Just hiking, I replied, trying to sound casual. You? Same, he said, his gaze fixed on me. Shame about what happened here. Yeah, looks like they left in a hurry, he chuckled softly. Or something made them leave. I swallowed hard. Well, I should get going. Don't let me keep you, he said, stepping aside. I walked briskly back to the trail, feeling his eyes on me the whole time. By the time I reached my RV, my heart was pounding. Maybe it's time to move on to another site, I thought. I started packing up when I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, half expecting Jed, but it was another man, this one wearing a park ranger uniform. Sorry to startle you, he said. I'm Ranger Thompson, just making my rounds. Oh, thank goodness, I sighed in relief. Randy Farnsworth. Everything all right? You look a bit shaken. I debated whether to mention Jed, but decided I might sound paranoid. Just had an odd encounter earlier. Do you know a man named Jedediah around here? The ranger's expression darkened. Jedediah Clark? Yeah, goes by Jed. He nodded grimly. We've had reports about him. I'd advise you to be cautious. He's not well. Not well how? I pressed. Look, it's probably best if you relocate to a more populated area of the park, he suggested. Safety in numbers. Understood, I said, feeling a knot in my stomach. Thanks for the warning. As he left, I hurried to finish packing. Just as I was about to start the engine, I realized I'd left my map on the picnic table. I stepped out to grab it, when something heavy struck me from behind. Everything went black. I awoke to a splitting headache and found myself tied to a chair inside what looked like an old cabin. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern, casting eerie shadows on the walls adorned with hunting trophies. Rise and shine, came Jed's voice from the darkness. What do you want? I demanded, struggling against the ropes. He stepped into the light, a sinister smile playing on his lips. Company. Is that too much to ask? Kidnapping isn't exactly the way to make friends, I retorted. He laughed. Oh, but we're past pleasantries now. Look, if it's money you want. Money? He interrupted. You think this is about money? No, all this is about survival. Survival? He began pacing. City folks like you come here thinking you own the place, leaving your trash, making noise, disrupting the balance. I'm sorry if I... Too late for apologies, he snapped. You and your kind are a blight. You're not making any sense, I said, trying to keep him talking while I worked at the knots. He pulled out a hunting knife, examining it thoughtfully. Sense? Sense is living off the land, respecting its laws, not hiding in metal boxes on wheels. Okay, noted. I'll just be on my way and promise to leave nature untouched, I said. He shook his head slowly. Can't let you do that. Before I could respond, there was a loud bang on the door. Jedediah Clark, this is Ranger Thompson. Open up! Jed's eyes flickered with rage. You just couldn't stay quiet, could you? As he moved toward the door, adrenaline surged through me. I managed to loosen the ropes enough to free one hand. Without thinking, I grabbed a heavy wooden stool and waited. As Jed turned back, I swung with all my might. The stool connected with his shoulder, causing him to drop the knife and stumble. "You little," he growled. I didn't wait for him to finish. I bolted for the back door, bursting into the cool night air. My RV was parked nearby, and I sprinted toward it, fumbling with the keys. As I jumped inside and started the engine, I saw Jed appear in the side mirror, fury etched on his face. I didn't look back. Later, I learned that Jed had been evading capture for months. He was a former survivalist who lost his grip on reality after a tragic accident claimed his family. As for me, next time someone suggests a nature trip, I'll politely decline. I'm outdoorsy, in that I like having drinks on patios. My name is Austin Gibson, and this happened back in 2011 in Shawnee National Forest, Illinois, when I first took a temporary ranger job there to help with the busy fall season. Never suspecting I'd leave that place with shaking hands and a heart full of questions. I remember stepping into that small ranger station around late September, feeling pretty good because I'd managed to snag a cheap motel room in town that morning. I had a bland cheese sandwich for breakfast, just something out of the convenience store freezer section, and washed it down with watery coffee. I wore a faded uniform passed down from a previous hire who'd left mustard stains near the left pocket. It smelled like stale sweat and cheap detergent, but I was just glad to have work. I was 25, broke, and eager to prove myself reliable. I liked the quiet of the forest trails, the dense maples and oaks, and the smell of damp leaves after last week's rain. We had a small team, just me and 2 others on rotation that day. Tom, older and with a bushy beard that he tied with a rubber band, always joked about his ex-wife and how her new husband sold fancy lawnmowers. And Gina, in her early 40s, usually wore a baseball cap over short-cropped hair. She had a habit of humming some old tune I couldn't place whenever she got nervous. She'd say, "Pat, you know that feeling when you think the woods are just a bit too still?" I didn't know what she meant back then. I thought forests were supposed to be quiet. That morning, Gina handed me a radio and said, "Don't wander off without checking in. It's not summer camp season, but we still get the odd hiker." By noon, I was on a trail known as Pine Hollow Path, which, despite the name, had more oaks than pines. The canopy let through thin beams of light, and the forest floor was scattered with red and brown leaves. I came across a half-eaten energy bar wrapper on the path, which struck me as odd because we usually lectured visitors about leaving no trash. I stuffed it in my pocket. About an hour later, I stumbled on something far more disturbing, a torn jacket sleeve snagged on a low branch. It looked recent, maybe a day old, and the fabric was stiff with something dark. I didn't want to think about it. That's when I radioed Tom. "Hey, found a torn piece of clothing. Could be a lost hiker. Anything on the logs?" Tom answered with a yawn. "We had a party of 3 who checked in yesterday. They should have been out by now." That sent a chill into my chest, and I began scanning the underbrush with more care. I followed a faint trail of broken twigs and disturbed leaves off the main path. About 20 feet in, I smelled something unpleasant, like old meat left out on a warm countertop. I advanced slowly, heart tapping at my ribs. In a small clearing behind a fallen tree, I found the body of a man. He looked about 40, wearing a hiking vest and boots. His left arm lay twisted at a strange angle, and part of his torso had been torn open. The sight made my stomach lurch. I stepped back, pressed my hand against my mouth, and tried to breathe through it. Then I spoke into the radio with forced calm. "Tom," I said, "I've got a deceased male hiker here. Looks like an animal attack." Gina broke in, her voice uneasy. "Animal attacks are rare here. Are you sure?" I didn't answer her. I just gave them my coordinates. While I waited, I squatted down, thinking maybe the poor guy slipped and got mauled by a coyote or something. But coyotes don't usually leave bodies like that. I took in the surroundings, noticing deep scratches on a nearby tree trunk, higher than my shoulders. There was a pattern, something I couldn't quite place. But it definitely wasn't from a raccoon or a bobcat. When Tom and Gina arrived, they were both grim-faced. Tom tried to hide his shock. Gina stopped humming. She just stared and shook her head. We decided to search for the other two hikers from that party of three. Tom radioed the station to call for authorities. We couldn't just leave, not with the possibility of survivors. We moved deeper into the woods, spreading out but staying close enough to yell if something happened. I remember wiping sweat off my forehead, even though it wasn't that hot. The silence weighed on me. Sometimes a branch cracked underfoot and I jumped. Then we found another body. This time, it was a woman, slumped against a boulder. Her pack was gone, her face frozen in a look of pain. She had similar wounds, and the ground around her was stained and scattered with damp leaves. I wish I hadn't eaten that cheese sandwich earlier. "Hello? Anybody out here?" I called. No answer. I heard Tom whisper, "This is bad, Pat." I nodded, my mouth dry. Gina, who walked a short distance away, suddenly shouted, "Found footprints!" We hurried over. There were large impressions in the soft earth, bigger than any mountain lion print I'd seen in guides. They looked like a cat's, but heavier. Deeper. A cougar? Tom asked. Gina shrugged. Not impossible, but she trailed off. Something about these tracks bothered her. They showed long strides, more powerful than what we expected. We decided to keep searching for the third hiker. The afternoon light was fading, and we had to use flashlights. Being out there as dusk approached set me on edge. I found myself talking just to break the tension. "Tom, remember that big raccoon we saw by the dumpsters yesterday?" Tom grunted. I tried a lame joke. "If that raccoon shows up now, I'll offer him my last candy bar to watch our backs." No one laughed. Then, at twilight, we heard a scream, quick and sharp. We ran toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks. We found the third hiker, alive at first. A young guy in his 20s, holding his side, crouched under a half-fallen tree. "Help!" he shouted, voice cracking. We rushed over, flashlights jumping. He looked terrified, eyes darting behind us as if expecting something to pounce. It took them. It's out here. He didn't have to say more. We heard heavy steps in the brush, a soft rustling that made my skin prickle. We formed a semicircle around the wounded hiker, shining our beams into the dark trees. I saw a shape then, low and muscular, moving between trunks. No distinct silhouette, just movement. My heart thundered. Then it rushed forward. I could barely describe its form. A cat-like body, maybe 5 feet long, thick shoulders, dark fur that blended with the night. It moved quietly, at first. Then, thump! It slammed into the injured hiker. He screamed. We shouted, shining lights into its face. I saw powerful jaws flash open and close. The man's screams turned into choking gasps. I stepped forward, but Tom grabbed my shoulder. "Pat, no. It's too late." Gina swung her flashlight at the creature's head, and it hissed, a strange, sharp sound. Then it ran off into the darkness, leaving the man on the ground. He was gone. And that was only the beginning. We knelt beside him. He was gone. It had ended his life in seconds. Gina cursed under her breath. Tom looked like he might cry. I felt sick again, kneeling there, trying to hold my flashlight steady. Now we had 3 dead hikers, a killer animal somewhere in the woods, and night pressing in on all sides. We made a plan to retreat to the station. The radio crackled as we tried to call for backup. Spotty reception. "We need the phone," I said. Tom nodded. We hurried back along the trail, our flashlights bouncing over tree trunks and roots. Gina whispered, "Don't run. Running sets it off." We moved briskly but tried to look calm, which was impossible. I gripped my radio so hard my knuckles hurt. Halfway back, we realized something was keeping pace with us. Branches snapped lightly. I tried to catch a glimpse but only saw shifting silhouettes. We picked up speed. "I'll buy us all dinner if we get out of this," I muttered. No one responded. I suppose we all wanted to pretend we were anywhere else, maybe at a diner with French fries and milkshakes, not stuck in the dark with a vicious predator. At one point, Tom lagged behind to catch his breath. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll be right there." Gina and I stopped, turned back. "Don't be stupid," she said. "We stick together." He nodded and lumbered forward, chest heaving. He was bigger than me, maybe 50 pounds heavier, and the fear weighed on him. We formed a tight group, shining lights in every direction. The woods smelled damp and earthy, and every sound set me on edge. We reached a fork in the path. By then, I noticed fresh scratches on the bark of a large oak, long, parallel marks, too clean to be random. We heard a sudden snapping of twigs and spun around. The creature rushed past our lights so fast I barely saw more than a dark shape. Tom shouted, "There!" But it moved in a blur. Gina and I tried to stand back to back with him. We breathed in quick, shallow gasps. I held a length of sturdy branch I'd picked up, though I doubted it would help much. A moment passed, maybe less. Then it struck again, hitting Tom this time. I swung the branch wildly, hitting only air. I saw Tom on the ground, coughing, struggling. Gina screamed at me to help him. I knelt and tried to pull him up. His chest and shoulder were torn, and his hands shook as he reached for me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I tried to stop the bleeding with my jacket, but it was too much. His eyes fluttered. I pleaded, "Come on, Tom. Don't leave me here, man." He said nothing else. Gina stood guard, flashlight shaking in her grip. The forest was too silent again. After a minute, I realized Tom was gone. My eyes stung with tears. I swallowed hard and said, "Gina, we have to run." We ran. I know I said not to run earlier, but we had no choice. Our boots pounded the dirt. The station wasn't far. The creature crashed through the brush behind us, keeping pace. My lungs burned, and my mind spun. I tried to recall if there was a service rifle locked at the station. Maybe. Maybe not. Anything would help. Gina was ahead of me, her flashlight beam shaking. We broke through the last stand of trees and saw the faint light from the station's bulb. I fumbled for the door, keys rattling. Inside, I slammed it shut and pushed a heavy cabinet against it. Gina collapsed into a chair, gasping. "We lost Tom," she said flatly. I nodded, pressing my forehead against the door. We tried the landline phone, static. We tried the radio, no immediate response. Maybe the call had gone out earlier and help was on the way. Maybe not. While Gina searched for a first aid kit, I peered out a small window. Nothing but darkness and the suggestion of trees. I listened hard, hearing only the hum of the station's small fridge. There was a box of flares on a shelf, and I pulled one out, thinking maybe we could signal someone. I waited, half expecting the animal to burst in. But it didn't. Hours passed. Gina stayed quiet. I remember rummaging through a drawer and finding a half-eaten bag of pretzels. My throat was too tight to swallow. As the first hint of dawn broke, we dared to open the door a crack. The forest looked normal. Dew on leaves. Pale light filtering through. No sign of the creature. No strange prints by the door. Nothing. We stepped outside, tense, every sense sharpened. We didn't talk about going back to look for the bodies. We just knew we had to get the proper authorities and show them. We found a ranger truck behind the station, old, but it ran. Gina drove while I clutched the flare gun. My hands trembled with every bump in the dirt road. We made it out. But we carried what we saw inside our minds. When the sheriff's deputies and wildlife officers arrived later that day, they searched in teams, rifles ready. They found the bodies. They found unusual tracks. But I never heard a confident explanation. Maybe a rogue predator wandered in from another region. Maybe something escaped from a private collector's estate. I don't know. Gina and I never got a satisfying answer. They patrolled heavily for weeks. Nothing else turned up. Eventually, people said it must have been a one-time tragedy. I still think about it. I still see that creature's eyes in the beam of my flashlight. Sometimes, I wonder if it slipped away to another stretch of forest, still hungry, still waiting to surprise someone. I can't shake that thought. Even today, when I step outside at dusk, I pause and listen harder than I did before, just in case. My name is Logan Cooper, and this happened to me on September 14th, 1994. I've been a search and rescue officer for almost 2 decades now. I've seen a lot, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the fall of '88. It was one of those years when the forest seemed to breathe easier, the air crisp and cool, the leaves transforming into a kaleidoscope of red, orange, and yellow. Most of my days were spent patrolling the trails and helping lost hikers find their way back. It was a job I loved, one that gave me a sense of purpose and connection to nature. It started as a regular Friday. I was in the ranger station, sipping on a cup of coffee, the kind that's more bitter than soothing, when the call came in. A family reported their teenage son missing. They were camping in the dense woods of the Cascade Range, near a spot we locals called Blackwood Hollow. It wasn't a popular area. In fact, it was pretty remote, which made it all the more concerning. The boy, Kyle Thompson, had been missing for nearly 12 hours. I grabbed my gear, radioed my partner Rick, and we headed out. Rick was a good guy, a bit younger than me, with a sharp mind and quick wit. We joked about how every rescue mission felt like we were stepping into an old western, with us as the cowboys riding into the unknown. We reached Blackwood Hollow by late afternoon. The place had an eerie calm to it, a stillness that seemed to swallow sound. We met Kyle's parents at their campsite. They were frantic, the mother on the verge of tears, the father pacing like a caged animal. They explained that Kyle had wandered off the previous night, saying he was going to explore, but he never came back. Rick and I started our search, moving in a grid pattern, calling out Kyle's name. We had a good system, years of experience between us. As dusk settled, the forest grew darker, and our flashlights barely cut through the thickening gloom. There's something about the woods at night that gets under your skin, makes you feel like you're being watched. About an hour in, we found Kyle's backpack. It was lying at the base of a massive oak tree, partially covered in leaves. Inside were typical teenage things: a flashlight, some snacks, a notebook, but no sign of Kyle. We pressed on, our shouts becoming more urgent. Then we heard it, a faint, distant cry. It was hard to pinpoint, but it was there. We followed the sound, moving quickly now, the urgency driving us forward. The cries led us deeper into the forest, to a part I wasn't familiar with. The trees were denser, the path narrower. It felt like we were being funneled into a trap. We came upon a clearing, and there, in the middle, was a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, windows shattered, roof caved in. The cries were louder now, coming from inside. Rick and I exchanged a look. This wasn't right, but we had to find Kyle. We approached the cabin cautiously, flashlight sweeping the area. I called out, "Kyle, you in there?" No response, just the continued whimpering. We pushed the door open and the smell hit us first, damp, rotting wood mixed with something metallic. Blood. Inside, the place was a mess. Furniture overturned, debris everywhere. In the corner, we saw him, Kyle, huddled and trembling, eyes wide with fear. But he wasn't alone. Standing over him was a figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Before we could react, the figure lunged at Rick, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. Rick went down, and I barely had time to draw my knife. I slashed at the figure, connecting with something solid. It hissed, a sound that made my skin crawl, and retreated into the shadows. I grabbed Kyle, pulling him to his feet. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted out of the cabin. Rick was on the ground, clutching his side but alive. We made it to the clearing before I dared to look back. The figure was standing in the doorway, watching us, but it didn't follow. We helped Rick up, and with Kyle between us, we made our way back to the campsite as fast as we could. The whole time, I felt like we were being hunted, the trees closing in around us. But we didn't stop, didn't look back, until we were safely at the ranger station. Kyle's parents were relieved, their gratitude evident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Rick was taken to the hospital, his wound deep but not life-threatening. I stayed behind, trying to piece together what had happened. The authorities were called, and a search was conducted. But the cabin was never found. Kyle's memory was hazy, filled with fragments of a nightmare he couldn't fully recall. He mentioned being lured by a voice, something that seemed human but wasn't. Weeks passed, and the incident was quietly swept under the rug. Officially, it was chalked up to a bear attack, though anyone who'd seen the wounds knew better. Rick recovered, but he left the job soon after. Said he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. I stayed on, but Blackwood Hollow became a place I avoided. The forest felt different, like it had secrets best left undisturbed. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I sometimes hear that faint cry, a reminder of the things that lurk in the shadows of our world. Years later, the memory still haunts me. Not just the encounter, but the sense of helplessness, the realization that there are things out there beyond our understanding. Kyle grew up, moved away, tried to forget, but I couldn't. It became a part of me, a shadow that followed wherever I went. One night, I was having a beer with an old friend, Jason. He was another ranger, one who had his own stories of the strange and unexplainable. We were sitting on my porch watching the stars when I finally told him about that night in Blackwood Hollow. He listened, a thoughtful look on his face, then nodded. "I've heard similar stories," he said. "Different places, different faces, but the same kind of presence. Some say it's a spirit. Others think it's something more primal, more ancient." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his words hanging in the air. It didn't bring me comfort, but it felt good to share the burden, to know I wasn't alone in my experience. Life went on, as it does. I kept doing my job, helping those lost in the wilderness, always with a cautious eye on the tree line. I never went back to Blackwood Hollow, and neither did Rick. It became one of those places with a story attached, a whispered legend among the rangers. In the end, I think that's what it was, a legend, something that exists on the edges of our reality, only revealing itself when we stray too far into the unknown. And maybe that's for the best. Some things are meant to remain hidden, their mysteries left unsolved. I still wonder about that night, about what I saw and what might have happened if we hadn't escaped. It's a question that lingers, unanswered, a reminder of the thin line between our world and whatever lies beyond. And as long as I'm alive, I'll carry that memory with me, a testament to the things we'll never fully understand.